She took the house. She took the money. She took the cars, the savings, and every last thing they'd built together. And she stood on those courthouse steps smiling like she'd just won the greatest victory of her life. She had no idea she'd just made the most catastrophic mistake a person could make, because the man she'd spent 3 years destroying, the quiet mechanic in the worn flannel shirt who never once raised his voice in that courtroom, wasn't just walking away broke. He was walking away free. And freedom, for Ethan Calloway, was worth far more than she could ever imagine. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and it is absolutely worth it. The waiting room outside courtroom 7 smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, the kind of place that absorbed misery the way wood absorbs water, slowly, permanently, until it was all the building knew how to hold. Ethan Calloway sat in a metal folding chair near the window, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on the floor. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours the night before. He could feel it behind his eyes, that dull, gritty ache that no amount of coffee fixed. His attorney, a quiet, careful woman named Carol Brandt, sat beside him with a legal pad covered in blue ink, flipping pages like she was looking for something she'd already lost. "You ready?" she asked without looking up. "No," he said honestly. She almost smiled. That's probably the most honest answer I've heard in 20 years of doing this. Ethan looked down at his hands. There was still grease under his thumbnail from the transmission job he'd finished at midnight. He'd scrubbed 3 times, and it hadn't come out. He thought about how Monica used to hate that. The way the garage followed him home, she'd say. "You smell like oil again, Ethan? Can't you just wash properly?" He'd always tried. It was never quite enough. Through the tall, narrow window beside him, the January sky over Bismarck was the color of old pewter, low and heavy and threatening snow that hadn't arrived yet. 3 crows sat on the power line across the street, not moving, just watching. He stared at them longer than made sense. There was nothing particularly interesting about crows, but they were outside and he was in here, and sometimes that was enough. The courtroom door opened and Monica walked out with Derek Lawson at her shoulder. Derek was everything that Ethan was not, or at least everything that Monica had decided she now wanted. He was tall in the expensive suit way, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that photographs well and a haircut that cost more than Ethan's weekly grocery run. He was Monica's personal attorney, which had raised eyebrows among the people who knew them, because attorneys weren't supposed to represent people they were romantically involved with. But Derek had a way of making inconvenient rules disappear. Monica looked at Ethan, the way she'd been looking at him for the better part of a year, with a particular cocktail of pity and contempt, like he was something left on the curb that she was surprised hadn't been picked up yet. She was dressed sharply, a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her dark hair pinned back. She'd always been beautiful. Ethan had loved her once with the kind of open-handed love that didn't know how to protect itself. That love had taken a long time to die. He still wasn't entirely sure it had finished the job. "Ethan." She nodded at him like a stranger she vaguely recognized. "Monica." Derek placed a hand on the small of her back and steered her past without acknowledging Ethan at all, which was probably for the best. Carol leaned slightly toward him. "Focus," she said quietly. "We've got 20 minutes. The courtroom itself was the kind of functional ugly that government buildings specialize in. Drop ceiling tiles, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell, wooden benches that had been uncomfortable for decades and had no plans to stop. Judge Patricia Holt presided from behind the bench with the energy of a woman who had heard every variation of human disappointment and had made a kind of peace with it. She was in her late 50s, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, her expression professionally neutral. Ethan sat at the left-hand table with Carol. Monica and Derek occupied the right. Between them was a document nearly 2 inches thick, the proposed divorce settlement that Derek had assembled over the previous 8 months with what Carol privately described as surgical aggression. The house. Monica. The joint savings account. Nearly $40,000. Monica. The Ford 250 pickup and the Honda Accord. Monica. The investment portfolio in Ethan's name. Monica. A collection of tools and equipment from Ethan's garage worth over $12,000. Monica. What remained for Ethan, according to Derek's proposal, his personal clothing, a 2004 Chevy Silverado with 190,000 miles and a cracked windshield, and his debts. And Sophie. Custody of his 7-year-old daughter was the only thing Ethan had put in writing that he wanted. The only thing he'd argued for in every meeting, every mediation session, every late-night call with Carol when he was sitting on the floor of his rented room because he hadn't been able to afford furniture yet. The house didn't matter. The money didn't matter. The truck didn't matter. Sophie was everything. The proceedings took the better part of 3 hours. There were testimonies and counter-testimonies, character witnesses, documentation of income and assets, affidavits from neighbors, and Sophie's school counselor. Derek was smooth and methodical in the way that good attorneys are when they've done their homework. Measured, authoritative, always just slightly condescending without crossing the line into something that would irritate the judge. Ethan answered questions quietly and directly. He didn't embellish. He didn't defend himself against the worst of what was being implied about his parenting capacity. Carol had coached him extensively on this. They want you to react. Don't give them the reaction. Give them the truth and let the truth do the work. He described his schedule, the garage hours, the school pickups, the Tuesday nights helping Sophie with math homework she hated, the Sunday mornings making pancakes in the shape of animals because she'd gone through a phase at age 5 and never entirely grown out of it. He talked about her asthma and her medication schedule and the emergency contacts saved in his phone in order of proximity to her school. Monica's attorney argued that a mechanic's irregular hours made consistent parenting difficult, that Ethan's rental property, a single room in a house shared with 2 other men, was not a suitable environment for a child. Carol argued that Ethan's hours were self-determined, that he'd already arranged his schedule specifically around Sophie's school day, and that a stable, loving parent in a modest home was preferable to a technically larger space with an emotionally inconsistent one. She didn't say emotionally inconsistent quite so directly, but the meaning was clear enough. Monica's jaw tightened. Judge Holt listened to all of it with the same measured stillness. She took notes. She asked clarifying questions. She called a 15-minute recess around noon and returned looking exactly the same as she'd left. Ethan ate nothing during the recess. He drank half a cup of vending machine coffee that tasted like hot brown water. Carol went over her notes. His knee wouldn't stop bouncing. "Stop that," Carol said, not unkindly. He stopped. "You're going to be okay," she said. "You don't know that." She looked at him over the top of her glasses. "No," she admitted. "But I know Patricia Holt, and I know what a good father looks like to her. She's seen enough bad ones." When the session resumed, Judge Holt read her decisions in the flat, even voice of someone reciting something she had carefully thought through and would not be argued out of. The house. Monica. The savings. Monica. The vehicles. With the exception of the Silverado. Monica. The investment portfolio. Monica. Derek allowed himself a small, satisfied exhale. Monica glanced at him. Something passed between them. Not quite a smile. More like the private acknowledgement of a foregone conclusion finally confirmed. Then Judge Holt looked up from her papers. With respect to the matter of physical and legal custody of Sophie Marie Calloway, age 7. She paused, adjusted her glasses. Having reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties, the testimony of the minor child's school counselor and pediatrician, and the in-camera interview conducted on January 8th, this court awards primary physical and legal custody to the father, Ethan James Calloway. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Monica went completely still. Derek's hand, which had been resting on the table, curled slightly. Ethan didn't move for a moment. He wasn't sure his body remembered how. Then Carol's hand landed on his forearm, a brief, firm pressure, and he exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 hours. Monica Reed is awarded visitation rights on a schedule to be determined by mutual agreement or by the court if agreement cannot be reached. Child support obligations will be calculated and formalized within 30 days. Judge Holt set down her papers. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Outside the courtroom in the gray fluorescent corridor, Monica found Ethan before he could reach the elevator. "This isn't over," she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something ragged at the edges of it. "You think you can take her from me?" "I didn't take her from you. Ethan kept his voice low. The judge made a decision. You can appeal if you want to. Oh, I know what I'm doing. She stepped closer. Derek was a few feet behind her, arms crossed, watching. You have nothing, Ethan. You're living in a room. You drive a truck that barely runs. What do you think this looks like? It looks like a man who shows up for his kid, he said. Every single time. Something flickered in her face. He wasn't sure what it was. Anger, maybe, but with something older underneath it. Something that might have been once, close to regret. It didn't last. Enjoy the win, she said, while it lasts. She turned and walked away, her heels sharp against the tile floor. Derek fell into step beside her, his hand finding her back again. Carol appeared at Ethan's elbow. Ready? Yeah. He looked at the elevator doors closing ahead of them. Yeah, let's go. Yeah. The building's main entrance opened onto a wide concrete plaza that overlooked a stretch of two-lane street. It was February cold, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself slowly, but just arrives all at once the moment you step outside, like a wall you walk into. Ethan pushed through the glass door and stopped. There were 4 vehicles parked along the curb across the street that had not been there when he'd arrived that morning. Black SUVs, expensive and identical in the way that things become identical when money is no object. Their engines were running, the exhaust curled in the cold air. As he watched, one of the rear doors opened. A woman stepped out. She was around 30, maybe a year or two younger than Ethan, dressed in a coat that somehow looked simple and wildly expensive at the same time. She had dark auburn hair that moved in the wind, and the kind of stillness in her posture that came not from being calm, exactly, but from being in complete control of the space she occupied. She looked at Ethan the way you look at someone you've spent a long time trying to find. He had no idea who she was. She crossed the street with 2 men flanking her at a respectful distance. As she approached, the door behind Ethan opened and Monica stepped out, still mid-sentence to Derek, and stopped when she saw the convoy. The woman stopped a few feet from Ethan. Ethan Calloway, she said. Not a question. Yeah. My name is Olivia Harrington. She held out her hand. I'm sorry it took me this long to find you. He shook her hand because it seemed like the thing to do. Her grip was firm and brief. He still had no idea what was happening. Monica stood a few feet behind him now, staring at the SUVs, at the 2 men in their dark coats, at this woman who had just said Ethan's name, like it was something she'd been carrying a long time. Should I know you? Ethan asked. No, Olivia said simply. But I think you should probably know some things about yourself. Can we talk somewhere warmer? He looked at Carol, who looked back at him with wide eyes and no answers. He looked at Sophie's drawing crumpled in his jacket pocket, a purple dinosaur she'd made at school that week, and asked him to keep safe. He'd kept it. All right, he said. What? Carol stayed behind to file paperwork. Ethan got into the back of the lead SUV, and Olivia sat across from him. The interior was quiet and warm and smelled like leather and something that might have been sandalwood. The driver pulled away from the curb without being asked. I need to pick up my daughter by 3:30, Ethan said. You will, Olivia said. We have time. He looked at her. She had a quality that was difficult to name, not exactly cold, but composed in a way that felt practiced, like someone who'd learned early that showing the wrong thing at the wrong moment was a kind of vulnerability they couldn't afford. You said you've been looking for me, he said. Why? She opened a leather folder on the seat beside her and removed a single photograph. She handed it to him. It was a picture of a woman he hadn't seen in almost 9 years, tall, dark-haired, standing in front of a building that he didn't immediately recognize. She was laughing at something off camera. She looked the way she always looked in his memory, like someone who forgot to be tired. His mother. His chest did something complicated. Where did you get this? Her desk. Olivia's voice was careful. Your mother's desk at Calloway Aerospace. She kept it there for years. He looked up. Calloway Aerospace. It was her company, Olivia said, before she died. And technically, legally, through a trust structure she set up 9 years ago. She paused, watching him. It's been yours. What? There are moments in a life that break the thing you thought was a straight line into something else entirely. Ethan had had a few of those. The day Sophie was born, slipping into the world at 3 a.m. with more noise than he'd been prepared for, crying in a way that seemed almost offended by the whole business of existing. The day his mother called from the hospital in a voice that was trying to sound normal, and he'd known immediately that nothing was normal at all. And now this. He sat in the back of a luxury vehicle in the parking lot of a Bismarck diner where Olivia had suggested they stop, and he tried to absorb information that his brain kept refusing to process in a linear way. His mother, Catherine Calloway, had inherited controlling interest in an aerospace engineering firm from her own father in 2007. She had, with the help of several key engineers and an aggressive growth strategy, spent the next decade transforming it from a mid-sized regional contractor into one of the most significant private aerospace corporations in the northern United States. By the time she was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition in 2014, the company had defense contracts, commercial aviation partnerships, and a research division that was developing propulsion systems that the industry press was quietly excited about. She had never told her son. Ethan wrapped both hands around a mug of black coffee and tried to understand that sentence. She had never told him. She wanted to protect you, Olivia said. She was sitting across from him in the booth, her own coffee untouched. That's the best explanation I have. She said once, in a board meeting I wasn't supposed to be in, that she'd watched money change people her whole life. She didn't want it to change you. So she just didn't mention it. She set up a trust, named you as the primary beneficiary. You were supposed to be informed when you turned 30. I'm 32. There were delays. Olivia's jaw tightened slightly. Legal complications. People who were not acting in good faith. That's part of why I'm here. Ethan set down the mug. Outside the diner window, a woman was struggling to get a stroller through a patch of icy sidewalk, her whole body focused on the effort. He watched her make it. She didn't look around to see if anyone had noticed. How much? He asked. Of the company's value? Of all of it. Olivia held his gaze. Current valuation is approximately $4.3 billion. The trust, with accumulated distributions and interest over 9 years, comes to roughly... Stop. He held up one hand. He needed a second. He needed several seconds. Just stop for a second. She stopped. He breathed. The woman outside had reached the corner and turned, the stroller bouncing over the curb cut. Gone. What's happening to the company? He asked, because that felt like a more manageable question than anything else she'd just said. Olivia leaned forward, and for the first time the composure slipped a little, just around the edges. Just enough that he could see the real urgency underneath it. That, she said, is the part I really need you to understand. Calloway Aerospace's flagship project, a proprietary short-range commercial aviation system designed around an entirely new approach to fuel efficiency, had been in development for 6 years. It was close. The engineers working on it said they were 18 months from a prototype that would change the economics of regional air travel in a fundamental way. 2 months ago, someone had started stealing it. Not clumsily, not quickly. Whoever was responsible had been careful and methodical, extracting sections of the research in small pieces through what appeared to be a series of misdirected server access events. The kind of thing that looked like accidents until you stacked them up and looked at the pattern. Olivia had been serving as the company's acting chairwoman since Catherine's death 3 years earlier, a role she'd stepped into at Catherine's specific written request, having worked alongside her for 5 years as a senior operations executive. She'd held things together, but the company's bylaws were clear. In the absence of the named heir formally claiming leadership, the board's power to make major decisions was limited. Strategic partnerships couldn't be finalized. The defense contract renewals were stalling. And now, with active corporate espionage bleeding the company's most valuable intellectual property, the board was fracturing. They needed Ethan. Not as a figurehead. Not as a name on a document. They needed him because his mother had built her research division around a specific engineering philosophy, a framework she'd called the Calloway method, a way of approaching propulsion design that was almost frustratingly difficult to explain in layman's terms and almost impossible to replicate from the outside. And Ethan, who had been building and repairing engines since he was 14 years old in his grandfather's shop, who had spent 2 years in a community college mechanical engineering program before life redirected him, who had always had an almost intuitive relationship with the way machines worked. He understood it. Maybe not in the way his mother would have articulated it, but in the bones and hands way, the way you understand something you learned before you knew it was something to learn. Olivia slid a photograph across the table. It was a schematic, partial, printed on plain paper. He looked at it. His eyes moved across it slowly, the way they moved across any engine diagram, reading it in the way other people read text. "This is wrong," he said, after a moment. Olivia went very still. "Which part?" He pointed to a component in the lower right section. "This pressure ratio. Whoever drew this doesn't understand the airflow at this stage. They're running it too hot at entry." He paused. "This isn't your design, is it?" "No," she said quietly. "That's the version that appeared in documents belonging to a competitor, a company that should not have had access to anything remotely close to this." He set the schematic down. "And you think I can help figure out where the leak is?" "I think you might be the only person who can," she said, "because the people stealing this need to understand what they're taking to use it. And the way they've been modifying it tells us something about who they are." She paused. "And I think, if you're willing to come back with me, we can stop this before they get enough to move forward." Ethan looked at the photograph of his mother that Olivia had set on the table between them. His mother, laughing at something off camera. Her company? Her life's work. "Sophie comes with me," he said. "Of course. And I need to call her school and sort out the pickup and pack a bag. And I need to understand, fully understand, what I'm agreeing to before I agree to it. That's fair?" He picked up the schematic again, looked at it again. The pressure ratio was wrong, obviously wrong once you knew what to look for. He could feel his mind already working on it, the way it always worked on problems with moving parts. "Where's the company based?" he asked. "Main research facility is in Fargo. Corporate headquarters in Minneapolis." She paused. "But the engineering department your mother built, the one that matters most right now, is in Bismarck." He looked up. 15 minutes from here," she said. Dead. He called the school from the parking lot, standing in the cold with his jacket unzipped because he'd forgotten to close it. He made arrangements with the front office for Sophie to wait in the after-school program. He called Carol to let her know that something significant had happened and that he would explain later, and Carol, who had 20 years of listening to people explain complicated things, simply said, "All right, Ethan, you know where to find me." Then he called his rented room's landlord, a retired electrician named Gus, who always picked up on the second ring, and told him he might need to hold the room for another month without being entirely sure what he was doing or how long it would take. Gus said that was fine and asked if everything was okay. Ethan looked at the SUVs lined up at the curb, at the woman inside who was waiting for him with a $4 billion problem. "I genuinely don't know," he said, "but I'll be in touch." He went inside and paid for both coffees. Olivia reached for her card and he shook his head. "I've got it," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You know you could buy this diner." "I know." He tucked his wallet away. "But right now I've got $14 and some change and a decent credit score, and that's what I've got. So let me pay for the coffee." Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't a smile exactly, but it was close. They went to Sophie's school together because Ethan had insisted on explaining things to Sophie himself rather than having a stranger show up. He didn't want her to be afraid. Sophie came out of the after-school room with her backpack on backwards, which she often did, and stopped when she saw her father standing with someone she didn't know. She was a small kid, slight for 7, with her father's dark eyes and a serious mouth that broke into enormous grins at unexpected moments. She wore her hair in 2 braids that she'd started doing herself, and which were never quite even. She'd been doing them herself since she was 6 because she'd explained to Ethan with great firmness she was not a baby. "Dad," she looked at Olivia. "Who's that?" "A colleague," Ethan said. "We're going to be working together for a while, which means we might need to go somewhere for a bit." Sophie's eyes, those dark, direct eyes, moved to Olivia with the frank assessment that small children perform without self-consciousness. "Are you nice?" Sophie asked. Olivia's composure, which Ethan was beginning to understand she maintained with considerable effort, flickered. "I try to be," Olivia said. "I don't always get it right." Sophie considered this answer for a moment, then seemed to approve of it because she nodded once and looked back at her father. Is there good food where we're going? I'll make sure of it, Olivia said. Okay. Sophie readjusted her backpack so it was on the right way. I need to get my drawing from my cubby. I made a dinosaur. Your dad has your dinosaur, Olivia said. He kept it in his jacket all day. Sophie looked at Ethan. He pulled the crumpled drawing from his pocket. Sophie gave him the particular look of a 7-year-old who has caught an adult doing something they find unexpectedly touching, but will never say out loud, and she tucked the drawing very carefully into the front pocket of her backpack. Okay, she said. I'm ready. Job. Monica was waiting by her car in the school parking lot. She'd been there a while, it looked like. Her arms were crossed, her breath clouding in the cold air. When she saw the convoy of SUVs pulling through the lot, her eyes moved to find Ethan, and she saw him getting out of the lead vehicle. And then she saw Sophie skip across the pavement toward him. She saw Olivia Harrington. She had done her homework quickly. She'd had to, because Olivia's face had registered somewhere in Monica's memory the moment she'd appeared on the courthouse steps, and she'd gone home and searched until she found it. She knew who Olivia was, or rather, she knew who Olivia appeared to be. A businesswoman, wealthy, connected, with a media presence that was significant but deliberately low profile. What she hadn't known, what none of them had known, was why Olivia Harrington was in Bismarck, North Dakota, looking for a mechanic. She understood it better now. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Ethan. She stepped forward. He stopped. Sophie slipped her hand into his without thinking about it, the way she always did when something felt uncertain. Monica. His voice was even. Where are you taking her? We'll be in the city for a few days. You have the contact information for my attorney. She can reach you when we're settled. That's not... Monica's jaw tightened. She glanced at Olivia, who was standing back, not interfering, her face professionally unreadable. Who are these people, Ethan? Colleagues, he said. Same word he'd used with Sophie. Colleagues. She said it like it didn't make sense. Monica. He shifted Sophie slightly behind him, just by an inch, the instinctive geometry of a parent interposing themselves. You got the house. You got everything. The judge gave me one thing, and I'm going to go take care of her. That's all that's happening right now. Something crossed her face that he couldn't quite name. She looked at Sophie, who was watching with those serious dark eyes. Soph, Monica said, softening for a moment in the way she sometimes could, unexpectedly. You're okay? I'm with Dad, Sophie said simply. Monica pressed her lips together. She nodded once and stepped back. Ethan got Sophie into the vehicle. As he closed the door, he looked back at Monica standing in the parking lot, her arms recrossing over her chest against the cold. She looked for just a moment like someone who was only beginning to understand what she'd lost. Not the settlement, not the house, or the money. Something older than that. Something she'd made a series of choices to discard and was only now watching it drive away with someone else. He got in the car. They drove to the Calloway Aerospace Satellite Facility on the south side of the city. It was a low, wide building set back from the road, unassuming from the outside. The kind of building that revealed nothing about itself from the street. Inside it was a different world. High ceilings, clean lines, the particular organized chaos of a working engineering space. Whiteboards covered in diagrams and equations, workbenches with components laid out in arrangements that looked random and weren't. A handful of engineers were still at their stations when they arrived. They looked up when Ethan walked in. A few of them clearly didn't know what to make of him. A man in a worn flannel shirt who walked through the door with a billionaire and a 7-year-old and stood in the middle of their floor like he was reading it. Which, in a way, he was. Sophie pressed close to his side but was watching everything with enormous eyes. It smells like the garage, she said quietly. Yeah, he said. It does. One of the engineers, a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a coffee cup that said world's okayest engineer in the kind of self-deprecating way that usually indicated the opposite, approached with a cautious expression. Dr. Marsh, Olivia said, this is Ethan Calloway. The woman looked at him for a moment, then she looked at his hands, the hands of someone who worked with them, grease-stained in the permanent way, knuckles mapped with the small scars that accumulate over years of close work with metal and heat. She said, which was not quite the greeting Ethan had expected. Your mother had the same hands. Something stuck in his throat. Did you know her? He managed. Worked with her for 11 years. Doctor. Marcia's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes were not. She was the most technically gifted person I've ever worked with and also the most infuriating. She looked at him more carefully. You look like her, around the eyes. Sophie tugged at Ethan's sleeve. Dad? She whispered. Yeah? Can I sit on one of those chairs, the ones with the wheels? He looked across the room to the rolling stools. He looked at Dr. Marsh. Go ahead, Dr. Marsh said, with the resigned air of someone who had dealt with plenty of people who shouldn't be on the rolling chairs and had learned to manage it. Just don't touch anything on the tables. Sophie was across the room in approximately 4 seconds. Dr. Marsh watched her go, then looked back at Ethan. She told me once, the engineer said, that she'd made a choice she wasn't sure was right, keeping you out of all this. She paused. She said she kept waiting for the right moment to tell you, and then she ran out of moments. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere across the facility, Sophie was spinning herself in a slow circle on a wheeled stool, her arms out, her face tilted up like she was checking for the horizon. I need to understand what's happening here, Ethan said. All of it. Start from the beginning. Dr. Marsh looked at Olivia. Olivia nodded. All right, Dr. Marsh said. She turned toward the nearest whiteboard and picked up a marker. This is going to take a while. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan said. Outside, the snow that had been threatening all day finally began to fall. Slowly at first, then with more conviction, the way North Dakota winters committed to things. Inside the facility, under the fluorescent lights, a woman who had known his mother drew the shape of a problem on a whiteboard, and Ethan Calloway, who had spent the day losing everything he'd built and everything he'd owned, began to understand the thing he'd been left. Sophie spun herself one more slow circle on her stool. Her braids were uneven. Her sneakers were untied again, and she was, in this strange and unfamiliar place that smelled like her father's garage, completely at ease. Dr. Marsh drew for a long time. She was not a theatrical person. She didn't build too dramatic reveals or pause for effect the way some people did when they knew they were delivering information that would change the shape of a room. She simply drew and talked and occasionally stopped to correct something she'd drawn, crossing it out with the blunt efficiency of someone who cared more about accuracy than appearances. The whiteboard filled up in sections, timelines, system diagrams, organizational charts with names circled or boxed or connected by lines that meant different things depending on their weight and direction. Ethan stood with his arms crossed and watched. He asked questions when he needed to. He didn't ask them to fill silence. Sophie had migrated from the rolling stool to a spot on the floor near the wall where someone had given her a scratch pad and a handful of colored markers, and she was working on something with the total absorption that 7-year-olds bring to creative projects they haven't explained to anyone. One of the junior engineers, a young man named Paul, who looked about 25 and had clearly never known quite what to do around children, had quietly set a granola bar next to her without saying anything, and she'd eaten it without looking up. The facility had mostly emptied by the time Dr. Marsh finished. The overhead lights had kicked into their evening cycle, slightly warmer and dimmer, and the snow outside the narrow windows was falling with real commitment now. Olivia sat at the edge of a workbench, her coat folded in her lap, and listened to things she already knew with the patience of someone who understood that other people needed to hear them for the first time. Here was the shape of it, as Ethan came to understand it over the course of 2.5 hours. Catherine Calloway had built her research division around a propulsion concept she'd called the meridian system, a framework for fuel flow dynamics in short-range turbine engines that was, if the mathematics held up in physical application, capable of reducing fuel consumption in regional commercial flights by somewhere between 31 and 38%. It didn't sound like much until you understood the economics of regional aviation, the fuel costs, the margin structures, the environmental compliance pressures building from every regulatory direction. Then it sounded like the kind of thing that would make its owner extraordinarily wealthy and make the industry rewrite several chapters of its operating assumptions. Catherine had been 2 years from a working prototype when her condition deteriorated. She'd brought in Olivia to manage operations, restructured the trust, and continued working from the hospital on the days she was capable of it, which, by all accounts, was more days than her doctors had considered reasonable. She died in the spring, 3 years ago, on a Thursday morning when the weather was just turning good. After that, the company had been run by a board that was trying its best with what it had, and Olivia, who was working 20-hour days and still felt the seams pulling apart, and a research team that was brilliant and committed and increasingly worried that without the specific instinct their founder had brought to the Meridian system's most complex unsolved problems, they were going to stall. They had stalled. Not completely. But the last 18 months of progress had been slower, and the internal disagreements about how to move forward had grown louder, and the board had begun to discuss, quietly, but not quietly enough, the possibility of licensing the technology rather than finishing it. Selling what they had to someone larger who might have the resources to complete it. That was when the thefts had started. Someone knew we were vulnerable, Dr. Marsh said. She was sitting on a stool now, the marker resting in her palm. Someone knew we were close enough to be worth stealing from, but fractured enough that we might not catch it quickly. How much did they get? Ethan asked. Enough to understand the framework, not enough to replicate it without filling in significant gaps themselves. She paused. The gaps require exactly the kind of understanding that can't be reconstructed from documentation alone. It has to be worked through, felt, in a way. She looked at him. Your mother would have said intuited. I would say it requires someone who has spent a very long time with the mechanical logic of it. Someone like her, yes, or someone she passed it to. Dr. Marsh was quiet for a moment. That's a significant assumption. Is it? He looked at the whiteboard, at the diagrams of the meridian system, the pressure ratios, the flow dynamics, the thermal management problem at the third stage that nobody had yet solved in a way that didn't create new problems elsewhere. He looked at it the way he'd looked at engine schematics since he was a teenager, not reading it exactly, more like listening to it, letting it tell him where it wanted to go. The thermal exchange at stage 3, he said. The reason nobody's solved it yet is because everyone's treating it like an isolation problem, like the heat is something to be managed after the fact. He moved toward the board. It's not. The heat at that stage is an output of an input problem 2 stages earlier, the entry dynamics. You need to redesign the intake geometry, not the exhaust management. Dr. Marsh stared at him. Olivia, at the edge of the workbench, had gone very still. That's... Dr. Marsh stopped. Started again. We've discussed intake geometry as a variable, but the computational modeling suggested the gain wasn't worth the redesign cost. The computational modeling was using the wrong baseline assumption, Ethan said. He wasn't being arrogant about it. He sounded, if anything, slightly puzzled, as if it were simply obvious once you looked at it the right way. What's your assumed inlet temperature? Dr. Marsh told him. He shook his head. That's a standard condition figure. But you're designing for regional routes, which means altitude variance during the critical operational window is more extreme than long haul. Your inlet temperature should be modeled at... He paused, doing something in his head that Olivia could not follow, and that made Dr. Marsh's eyes narrow with intense focus. Probably 8 to 12 degrees lower than what you've been using, which changes the thermal differential at stage 3 by enough that the exchange problem looks completely different. The facility was very quiet. That's your mother talking, Dr. Marsh said finally. Her voice was not quite steady. That is exactly the way your mother talked. Ethan looked at the whiteboard. He wasn't thinking about his mother right now, he was thinking about the problem, the way he always thought about problems, with a focus that narrowed everything else out. But the comment landed somewhere underneath the thinking and stayed there. I need paper, he said, and I need someone to pull the modeling data from the last 6 months. I want to see what assumptions went into the stage 3 calculations. Dr. Marsh stood up from her stool and said, without any of her previous caution, Paul, get him everything from the Meridian files, current cycle. Paul, who had been quietly pretending not to eavesdrop while reorganizing a component tray he didn't need to reorganize, moved immediately. From the floor by the wall, Sophie's voice. Dad? He looked over. She was holding up her scratch pad. On it, in orange and green marker, she had drawn what appeared to be a very large lizard wearing a hard hat, standing next to something that might have been a rocket or might have been a very ambitious tree. It was hard to tell. "What do you think?" she asked. He crossed the room and crouched down to look at it properly, the way he always did, taking it seriously, giving it his actual attention. "The hard hat's a good touch," he said. "Is he an engineer?" "She," Sophie corrected, with the firmness of someone who'd made this correction before. "She's a dinosaur engineer. She builds things." "What kind of things?" Sophie pointed at the possibly rocket, possibly tree. "Things that go up." He looked at the drawing for another moment. "I think she's good at her job," he said. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went back to adding details to the drawing. Ethan stayed crouched beside her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, one hand on her small shoulder, feeling the warmth of her through her sweater. Then he straightened up and went back to the whiteboard. He worked for 4 hours. He lost track of time in the way he sometimes did with engines, the way the problem became the whole room and everything else went to the edges. Paul brought him the modeling data, then more data when he asked for it, then coffee that went cold before he touched it. Dr. Marsh worked alongside him, sometimes questioning, sometimes validating, sometimes just watching with an expression that Ethan was too absorbed to notice, but that Olivia observed from her position near the wall. Something between grief and relief. The face of a person watching a door open that they'd been afraid would stay closed forever. Around 9 o'clock, Olivia touched his arm. "Ethan." He looked up. She tilted her head toward the corner of the room. Sophie had curled up on her jacket, which she'd folded into a rough pillow, and fallen asleep on the floor with the scratch pad still clutched loosely in one hand. The orange marker had left a small streak on her cheek where she'd rested against it. He stopped immediately. Whatever the meridian system needed, it would wait. He crossed the room and gathered his daughter with the practiced economy of a parent who'd carried a sleeping child many times. One arm under her knees, one supporting her back, her head falling against his shoulder with the boneless trust of deep sleep. She didn't wake up. The scratch pad slipped from her hand and Paul caught it and set it carefully on the nearest workbench. "There's a room in the back," Olivia said quietly. "We use it as a rest space. There's a couch." He followed her through a door at the rear of the facility, into a small room with the muted institutional comfort of a space designed to be functional rather than pleasant. A couch, a blanket folded over its arm, a small table with a lamp. He laid Sophie down and pulled the blanket over her without disturbing the orange streak on her cheek, and she made a small sound and pressed her face into the couch cushion and didn't wake. He stood there for a moment, looking at her. "She sleeps like that all the time," he said quietly, "like the world's completely safe." Olivia stood in the doorway. She didn't say anything. "I need to figure out a school situation," he said, "if this is going to take more than a few days. We can arrange a tutor, or there's a good school in the area that has been used for short-term enrollment before, children of contractors and visiting engineers." She paused. "We'll sort it out." He turned. She was leaning against the door frame with her arms crossed, not the power stance version of it, but the tired version, the one that suggested the composure was real, but it cost something to maintain all day. "You've been doing this by yourself for 3 years," he said. "I've had help." "You've been carrying it," he said, because that was the more accurate thing. The board, the research team, the legal complications, trying to hold the company together without the authority to make the decisions that would actually fix things. She looked at him for a moment. "Your mother trusted me to keep it together until you were ready." "I wasn't ready. I didn't even know it existed." "No." Something shifted in her face. "That part wasn't your fault. The legal complications I mentioned, some of them weren't accidental. Someone made sure the notification of the trust was delayed. Someone benefited from you not knowing." He was quiet. That was a different shape of problem, and he'd file it in a separate place in his mind for now. "Get some sleep," she said. "The couch folds out. There's another blanket in the cabinet." "Olivia." She paused. "Thank you," he said. "For keeping it together, for coming to find me." He paused. "For telling Sophie there would be good food." Something moved through her expression that she didn't quite manage to keep under control. It was there and gone in a second, and she turned back toward the main floor before it could develop into anything. "Good night, Ethan," she said. He pulled out the fold-out section of the couch, found the blanket, and lay down without taking off his boots, because that required more coordination than he currently had available. Sophie's breathing was steady and even. Outside, somewhere distant, the wind pushed at the building's eaves, the particular sound of North Dakota winter deciding it had something to say. He was asleep in 3 minutes. He was up again at 5:30, before the light. He sat on the edge of the fold-out and looked at his hands in the dark room for a while, the way he sometimes did when his brain was already running ahead of his ability to organize what it was running toward. A lot had happened in one day. A divorce proceeding that had taken his house and given him his daughter. A woman arriving in a convoy of black SUVs with a photograph of his mother. $4 billion and a stolen research project and a thermal management problem he was already half solving in his sleep. He needed a toothbrush. He needed a change of clothes. He needed to call his landlord again, and probably his sister in Minnesota, who did not know any of this was happening and who would have a great deal to say about it when she found out. He needed to eat something real, because the last thing he'd had was a gas station sandwich at 7 that morning. He needed to understand who was stealing from his mother's company and why, and what it had to do with the 9 years of deliberately kept silence that had left him standing in a courtroom this morning with nothing but a cracked windshield truck and the right to keep his daughter. He got up quietly and went back out to the main floor. Dr. Marsh was there. This surprised him. She was sitting at one of the workbenches with her coffee and a tablet, going through something with the focused look of someone who hadn't gone home. She looked up when he came in. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "Couple of hours in my office." She nodded at the coffee maker on the side table. "Fresh." He poured himself a cup and came to stand beside her. On her tablet was a log file, server access records, timestamps, user credentials. She was going through them manually, which was slow and painstaking and exactly the kind of thing that required the combination of expertise and stubbornness she appeared to have in abundance. "You're tracking the access pattern," he said. "Trying to." She set the tablet down and rubbed her eyes under her glasses. "The accesses look randomized, but randomized patterns have their own signature if you know what you're looking for. Someone did a decent job of making this look like system noise." She paused, "but not a perfect job." "What do you see?" She pointed at a sequence of timestamps. "These 4 access events are spaced in a pattern that occurs only during business hours, Monday through Thursday. Never Friday, never weekends. Which suggests whoever is doing this is working on a regular schedule. They're not a night operator. They're someone with a day job, accessing the system during windows when they won't be missed. Someone inside. Or someone with inside access. A credential that belonged to someone inside." She looked at him. "We've been working through a list of people who had authorization to the Meridian files in the last 18 months. Most of them are still on staff. 3 have left. 1 retired. 1 took a position at a university. 1... She stopped. "One what?" She pulled up a name on her tablet. She turned it so he could read it. He read it. The name meant nothing to him, but the notation beside it caught his attention. "Access suspended upon discovery of unauthorized data transfer. Former external legal counsel." "Legal counsel," he said. "The company used outside attorneys. For certain matters. Contract review, intellectual property filings, some of the trust documentation." She paused carefully. "This particular attorney handled several matters relating to the trust itself, including the notification process for the named beneficiary." Ethan set down his coffee. He thought about the year he'd spent not knowing about any of this, about the certified letter that was supposed to notify him of his inheritance at age 30 that had never arrived, about the legal complications Olivia had mentioned with that carefully controlled expression. "What's this attorney's name?" he asked. "Derek Lawson," she said. He stood very still. The coffee maker made a small gurgling sound in the silence. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the flat, gray-pink light of a North Dakota winter dawn, colorless and wide and utterly unromantic. "Derek Lawson," he said again. "You know him. He represented my wife in our divorce proceedings." He picked up his coffee again, not because he wanted it, but because he needed something to do with his hands. He was also... He stopped. He was being precise in his own head, working through the sequence. He was there when she accessed my home office. Last spring. I came home and they were both there, and she said she was looking for financial documents for the divorce filing. Dr. Marsh watched him. My home office, he said, was where I kept things my mother sent me. Letters. A few documents I hadn't understood at the time. A hard drive she mailed me 2 years ago that I never got around to looking at because I didn't know what was on it. He set down the coffee for real this time. I thought she was just sending me memories, things she wanted me to have. Or things she wanted to protect, Dr. Marsh said quietly. By putting them somewhere no one would think to look. He looked at her. We need to tell Olivia, he said. She'll be here at 7. Then I need you to start pulling together everything you have on Lawson's access history. And I need to know who his client was, the corporation that received the stolen data. Because Lawson isn't a thief. He's a fixer. He works for someone. That's a significant investigative step. We'd need federal... I know. He turned back toward the small room where Sophie was still sleeping, where his jacket was on the floor and his phone was in the pocket, and he had 3 texts he hadn't answered yet. I'm going to make some calls. It was 5:47 in the morning, and the world outside was the color of old ash, and the heat was just beginning to push through the facility's vents with the low mechanical sigh of a building waking up. And Ethan Calloway, who had walked into a courtroom yesterday morning with $14 and a cracked windshield, was beginning to understand that the thing he'd thought was the end of one life was something else entirely. He called his sister first. Her name was Diane, and she lived in Rochester with her husband and 2 boys. And she answered on the 4th ring, with the voice of someone who has been awake since 5, because that's just what life with kids does to you. Ethan, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, mostly. He looked at the ceiling. You remember Mom's company, the one she never talked about? A long pause. She talked about it a little. More than she talked to me about it. Another pause. What's going on? He told her. He kept it concise because that was how he communicated important things. Strip it down to what matters. Don't editorialize. Let the person you're talking to decide what they feel about it. Diane listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her and meant she was processing something significant. When he finished, the silence lasted about 10 seconds. $4 billion, Diane said, give or take. Ethan, I know. Mom knew this entire time. Yes. She just... Diane's voice broke, not with grief exactly, but with the frustrated affection of someone who loved a person who made impossible decisions for reasons that were complicated and real, and still, somehow, not entirely forgivable. She just watched you be a mechanic. She watched me be a father, he said. I think that's what she actually saw. Diane was quiet again for a moment. Then, are you okay? I don't know yet. Is Sophie okay? She's asleep on a couch in an aerospace facility. She's fine. Only your kid, Diane said, and he could hear the exhale of something close to a laugh. Call me when you know more. And Ethan, watch yourself. If Derek Lawson is involved in this and he knew about the trust, he had access to Monica. I know, she said, which means he had access to you. He hung up and stood with the phone in his hand for a moment. The facility was warming up around him. Somewhere, a door opened and footsteps moved across the concrete. Someone coming in early, the particular purposeful sound of a person arriving for a task rather than just a day. The thing about Derek Lawson was that Ethan had never particularly trusted him. He'd been Monica's choice of attorney, and Ethan had accepted that without examining it too carefully, because there were limits to how much energy he could spend on active suspicion when most of his energy was going toward keeping Sophie stable through the dissolution of her parents' marriage. Lawson had been smooth and competent and slightly contemptuous in the specific way of men who measured other men by their suits, and Ethan had simply maneuvered around him the way you maneuvered around a narrow obstacle, without engaging with it more than necessary. He hadn't considered that the obstacle might have been placed there deliberately. He went back to the workbench and stood beside Dr. Marsh and looked at the server access logs again. The pattern she'd identified was real. He could see it now that she'd shown him what to look for, the subtle regularity beneath the apparent randomness, the skeleton of a schedule under the camouflage of noise. What did Lawson access specifically? He asked. Which files? She pointed at a column on the tablet. Design documentation, preliminary modeling data, material specifications. She paused. And one other thing. The trust documents. The notification protocol specifically. The automated process that should have generated a certified letter to you at age 30. He was quiet for a moment. He didn't just delay it. No, she said. From what I can see, he redirected the automated notification to an email address that no longer exists, which means it never failed in any way that would generate an error alert. It just went somewhere and never arrived. 3 years. He'd been a mechanic with a failing marriage and a daughter to raise, and his mother's company had been hemorrhaging without him, and a man he'd never chosen or trusted had sat across a conference table from him in divorce proceedings while holding the thread of an entirely different life in his pocket. He thought about Monica. He thought about the way she'd looked at him in the parking lot after the custody ruling, that strange, unreadable moment that had passed across her face before she'd reassembled her expression. He'd interpreted it as regret. He wasn't sure anymore that regret was the whole story. Had she known? He sat with that question for a while and found that he genuinely didn't know the answer, and that the not knowing was its own specific discomfort. Olivia arrived at 7:12, slightly later than Dr. Marsh had predicted, carrying 2 paper bags from the diner they'd stopped at the day before, and a carrier with 4 coffees. She stopped when she saw Ethan at the workbench, took in the server log display on the tablet, looked at Dr. Marsh, and set the bags down. "You found something," she said. "Derek Lawson," Ethan said. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Tell me." He told her what Dr. Marsh had shown him and what he'd worked out about the home office access and what Diane had confirmed about the timeline. He was thorough, but not redundant. Olivia stood at the edge of the workbench and listened with her arms crossed, and her expression doing something complicated that she was keeping under control. The specific look of a person who has suspected something for a long time and is now watching the confirmation arrive and is not as relieved as they expected to be. "You already suspected him," Ethan said. "I suspected someone with legal access to the trust," she said. "Lawson's firm handled 4 separate matters for us. I flagged his access history 6 weeks ago, but without a named beneficiary formally claiming standing in the trust, I couldn't compel the legal investigation." She looked at him directly. "I needed you, not just for the engineering. I needed you legally so that the trust had an active claimant who could authorize the next steps. So you needed me to know about all of this before I could do anything about any of it?" "Yes." "And someone made sure I didn't know?" "Yes." He looked at the paper bags. "Is there breakfast in there?" "Egg sandwiches," she said, "and something called a bear claw that I was told is essential." "It is," Dr. Marsh confirmed. They ate standing up at the workbench, which was not comfortable or particularly dignified, and which felt, in some strange way, exactly right for the situation. Sophie woke up around 8 and came out of the back room with her hair loose. One braid had completely come undone, and the orange marker still on her cheek, and found 3 adults eating egg sandwiches in front of a whiteboard covered in aerospace diagrams. "I'm hungry," she said. "Bear claw?" Olivia offered. Sophie looked at the pastry with the serious expression of a person evaluating something they've never encountered before. "Why is it called that?" "Because it looks like a bear's paw." Sophie looked at it from a different angle. "Not really," she said. "But okay." She climbed onto a stool and ate it with both hands and got powdered sugar on her shirt, which was already not the cleanest shirt, and did not seem remotely troubled by any of this. Ethan watched her eat and felt, sitting in the middle of one of the more complicated situations of his life, a gratitude that he couldn't have fully articulated, but that was large and specific and a little painful, the way important things sometimes are. "We need to contact federal authorities," Olivia said, setting down her coffee. "The access logs, the trust document tampering, the evidence of data transfer, it's enough to open a formal investigation. But it needs to come from you." She looked at Ethan. "As the named beneficiary and the rightful company authority, your filing carries legal weight that mine doesn't." "All right," he said. "There's an attorney I trust. Not Lawson's firm, obviously. She's handled corporate espionage cases before. She's thorough and she doesn't move fast, but she moves correctly. Set it up. It'll take time. These things don't resolve quickly." "I understand that." He looked at the whiteboard, at the meridian system diagrams. at the thermal exchange problem that had been unsolved for 6 years and that he'd been turning over in his mind since he'd first looked at it. While it takes time, I'd like to keep working on the system. Dr. Marsh looked up from her tablet. The intake geometry, he said. I want to model the revised baseline assumptions and see if the stage 3 problem changes the way I think it does. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if I'm right, if you're right, Dr. Marsh said, you'll have solved the central obstacle of a 6-year development program in approximately 48 hours. That seems fast. It's not fast, she said. Your mother worked on that problem for 4 years before she got sick. Everything we built on top of it is because of what she put in. She paused. You're not solving it from scratch. You're recognizing something she already laid in that the rest of us couldn't see. He was quiet for a moment. Sophie, finished with her bear claw, was licking powdered sugar off her fingers and looking at the whiteboard with the casual curiosity of a child who has been raised around someone who brings their work home. Dad, she said, is that your drawing? Sort of. Dr. Marsh drew most of it. Sophie examined it. It's messy, she said. That's how good drawings usually are, he said. She seemed to accept this. She slid off the stool and came to stand beside him, her powdery hand finding his, and they stood together looking at the whiteboard with the meridian system diagrams and the thermal management problem, and 9 years of his mother's life mapped out in dry erase marker on a rollable board in a low building outside Bismarck, North Dakota. Outside, the snow had stopped. The morning light was thin and clear and very white, the way light is after a snowfall when the sky has finally finished what it was doing and gone quiet. Ethan looked at the problem on the board and held his daughter's hand and started again from the beginning. The attorney Olivia trusted was named Sandra Fitch, and she arrived from Minneapolis on a Thursday morning in a rental car she'd driven herself from the airport, which was the first thing Ethan noticed about her. She was in her early 50s, compact and efficient in the way of someone who had long ago stopped spending energy on anything that didn't serve a direct purpose. She wore no jewelry except a watch. She carried one bag. She shook Ethan's hand and looked at him with the frank, measuring attention of someone who needed to form an accurate opinion quickly and had learned to do it without being obvious about it. Your mother's company, she said, before she'd even sat down. I heard about it when she died. I thought about reaching out to whoever inherited it. She paused. Clearly, I should have. Clearly, Ethan said without bitterness. Just fact. They sat in the facility's small conference room. 4 chairs, a table, a whiteboard that was already half covered from the previous session, a window that looked out on the parking lot where Sandra's rental sat next to Olivia's SUV and Ethan's Silverado, which looked, in that company, like something that had wandered in from a different decade. Sandra opened her bag and removed a legal pad and a recording device, which she set on the table and looked at Ethan. Do you object to being recorded? No? Good. Then let's start from the beginning, your version. Don't edit it. He told her everything. He was thorough in the same way he'd been thorough with Olivia, but Sandra asked more questions, sharper ones, aimed at gaps he hadn't noticed he'd left. She asked about the home office access with Monica and Lawson in a way that forced him to be precise about the timeline, the specific date, what exactly had been in the room, what he'd actually seen versus what he'd inferred. She asked about the hard drive his mother had mailed him. She asked about the server access logs Dr. Marsh had pulled, and whether the original records were preserved in a form that maintained evidentiary integrity. Dr. Marsh, sitting beside Ethan, said yes, and produced documentation to support it. Sandra wrote for a long time. The scratch of her pen on the legal pad was the primary sound in the room for several minutes. All right, she said finally. Here's what you have. You have server access logs showing unauthorized data transfer using a credential set that traces back to Derek Lawson's firm. You have evidence of deliberate interference with a trust notification process, which is, depending on how we frame it, either fraud or something close enough that the distinction won't matter much. You have a pattern of access that corresponds to a regular business hours schedule, which points toward embedded ongoing operation rather than a one-time breach. She looked at her notes. And you have a hard drive that your mother sent you 2 years ago that you have not yet opened. I didn't know what it was, Ethan said. I understand that. But it needs to be opened now. under careful conditions with documentation of the chain of custody so that whatever is on it can be used. She paused. Do you have it with you? He shook his head. It's at my rental room. Can someone retrieve it? He thought of Gus, the landlord, who had a key for emergencies and who was the kind of man who didn't ask complicated questions when simple helpfulness would do. He took out his phone. Give me 10 minutes, he said. While he was on the phone in the corridor, he could hear through the partially open door Sandra saying to Olivia in a measured voice, the trust interference alone is worth a federal referral. The data theft connects it to a broader corporate espionage framework. But the question I have is, who is at the end of the chain? Lawson doesn't operate at this level for himself. He's a conduit. Olivia's response was too quiet to hear clearly, but the tone of it was one Ethan had come to recognize in the past 2 days. The controlled, deliberate cadence of someone who had been carrying a suspicion for a long time and was choosing the moment to put it down. He finished the call with Gus, who said he'd get the drive to the facility by noon, no problem. Did Ethan want him to bring anything else while he was at it? Just the drive, Ethan said. It's in the top drawer of the dresser, brown envelope. Got it. You doing all right? Working on it. Good enough, Gus said, and hung up. Ethan stood in the corridor for a moment. Through the window at the end of the hall, he could see the parking lot and, beyond it, the flat expanse of snow-covered ground that in warmer months was probably unremarkable and in February was beautiful in a stark, uncompromising way, white and wide and completely indifferent to whatever complicated things were happening inside buildings. He'd always liked North Dakota for that. The landscape here didn't perform, it just was. He went back into the conference room. Lawson works for someone, he said. Who? Sandra looked at him. That's what we need to establish. I'm asking if you have a theory. She was quiet for a moment, weighing something. There's a corporation called Vantage Propulsion Systems, based out of Denver. They've been trying to enter the regional aviation technology market for 5 years and have not had meaningful success because they don't have the foundational research to compete with what your mother built. She paused. They've made 2 separate acquisition offers to the Calloway Aerospace Board in the last 18 months. Both were declined by Olivia, who correctly identified them as undervalued attempts to acquire the Meridian system's intellectual property at a fraction of its worth. So instead of buying it, Ethan said, they decided to take it. That's the theory we'll need to prove, Sandra clicked her pen, which requires connecting Lawson's billing records to Vantage and connecting the transferred data to Vantage's current research program, and doing both in a way that satisfies federal evidentiary standards. How long? If we move quickly and the documentation holds up, months, not days. Ethan absorbed this. He'd known it wouldn't be fast. Fast wasn't the kind of thing that happened in legal processes, and he'd had enough of legal processes in the last week to understand that they moved in their own time, regardless of what you needed. Then we move quickly, he said. Sandra almost smiled. You sound like your mother, she said, with the tone of someone who had known Catherine Calloway slightly and remembered her as someone not especially interested in being told things couldn't be done on her preferred schedule. He wasn't sure if that was a compliment. He took it as one anyway. The hard drive arrived with Gus at 11:47, Gus being the kind of man who arrived early when he said noon and made no particular show of it. He was 63, built like someone who'd spent several decades doing physical work, with a gray beard and the specific steadiness of a person who has outlasted most of the things that were supposed to throw him. He handed Ethan the brown envelope and shook his hand and looked around the facility with the measured appreciation of someone who didn't show appreciation easily. Nice place, he said. It's not mine, Ethan said, and then stopped because that wasn't quite right anymore. I mean, it's complicated. Usually is, Gus said. He looked at Ethan for a moment with the direct attention of an older man who has seen enough to read things quickly. You're going to be all right. You and my attorney keep saying that. Then we're probably right. He nodded once, turned, and drove away in his own truck, which was only slightly less weathered than Ethan's. The drive was examined under Sandra's supervision in the conference room. Paul, who turned out to have a background in digital forensics in addition to his engineering work, he'd done his undergrad in computer science before switching to aerospace, a detail he offered quietly when Sandra asked if anyone on staff had the capability. handled the extraction with gloves on, and documented each step on his phone's camera. What was on the drive took several hours to fully catalog. There were engineering files, partial schematics, notes in Catherine's handwriting that had been scanned and digitized, early meridian system calculations that predated anything in the company's current archive. There were personal letters she'd apparently drafted but never sent, which Sandra set aside without reading and asked Ethan if he wanted to review privately. He said yes, and put them in the envelope and didn't look at them yet, because he didn't have room for that right now, and she would have understood that. And there was one folder labeled simply with a date, the year Ethan had turned 30, containing a series of documents that were not engineering files and not personal letters. They were financial records. Correspondence between Derek Lawson's firm and an entity registered in Delaware under a name that meant nothing until Paul cross-referenced it in a corporate registry database and found the parent company. Vantage Propulsion Systems. The room went quiet when Paul read it out. Sandra wrote something on her legal pad. "That," she said, "is the connection." It was 3 p.m. Outside, the light was already beginning to think about changing, the way winter light did here, arriving late and leaving early, as if it had somewhere else to be. Ethan sat at the conference table and looked at a printed page showing financial transfers between Lawson's firm and a Delaware shell company, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but existed in the territory between them. The transfers started 3 years ago. They continued through the divorce proceedings. They were ongoing. Every month, a retainer payment from Vantage's shell entity to Lawson's firm routed through enough intermediary accounts to look like consulting fees if you didn't follow the chain. "He was getting paid the whole time," Ethan said. "Yes," Sandra said, "during the divorce. He was representing Monica in my divorce while he was on retainer to a company that was stealing from the trust I didn't know I had." "That's what the evidence indicates." "And Monica—" He stopped. Sandra watched him. Olivia watched him. Doctor. Marsh, who had come in when Paul found the connection, watched him with the carefully neutral expression of someone who didn't want to influence what he was about to say. "Did she know?" he asked. "Not of anyone in particular. Just the question, out in the air." Nobody answered immediately because nobody had a certain answer. He thought about Monica in the parking lot of Sophie's school, the way she'd looked at him, that flickering thing behind her eyes that he'd read as regret, and now he wasn't sure how to read it all. He thought about the home office, the two of them in his space, Monica going through his things while Lawson stood nearby with his arms crossed and his expensive haircut, and Monica saying, "I'm just looking for financial documents." She'd seemed uncomfortable. He'd assumed it was the awkwardness of the situation, of being caught in a moment that felt like trespassing. Maybe it was something else. Maybe she'd been uncomfortable because she'd been asked to do something she hadn't fully understood the implications of by a man she trusted more than she should have. "I need to talk to her," he said. "Ethan," Olivia started, "not to accuse her, not yet." He looked at the table. "I just need to know what she knew and when, because if she was being used by Lawson the same way he used everything else—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The question of Monica was not simple, and it was not going to become simple, and he'd learned enough in the last 2 days to know that the things that looked straightforward from the outside were almost never that. "Let me make the federal referral first," Sandra said carefully. "Once that's filed, the investigation has jurisdiction, and I can advise you on what conversations are or aren't appropriate to have with anyone involved." She looked at him. "Can you give me 24 hours? He looked at the window, at the winter light thinning out. "Yes," he said. He spent the rest of the afternoon working on the meridian system with Dr. Marsh, because the problem needed to be worked on, and because working on concrete problems was how Ethan had always managed the things he couldn't solve immediately. The engineering question was specific and answerable. The Derek Lawson question was going to unfold on its own timeline. The Monica question was waiting for the right moment. The thing on the whiteboard was something he could actually touch. He revised the baseline inlet temperature assumption in the modeling software, working through the implications stage by stage with Dr. Marsh beside him, both of them running parallel calculations by hand as a check on the software output. The process was methodical and slow and required the kind of focused attention that left no room for peripheral thinking, which was exactly what he needed. By 6 o'clock, the revised model showed a thermal profile at stage 3 that was fundamentally different from what the previous calculations had produced. The exchange problem didn't disappear. It was too complex for that, but it shifted into a configuration that was workable, manageable, the kind of engineering challenge that had solutions rather than the kind that had only compromises. Dr. Marsh sat with the printout for a long time without speaking. "Well," she said finally, "is that a good well or a bad well?" "It's a—" She stopped. She took off her glasses and pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment, in the way of someone who is managing a strong reaction and wants to do it privately. Then she put her glasses back on. "Your mother worked on that stage 3 problem for 4 years, she said. "She was close. She knew she was close. The last time I spoke with her, about a month before she died, she told me she could feel the answer, but she couldn't quite reach it." Her voice was steady, but the effort of keeping it that way was visible. "She would have reached it if she'd had more time." "She did reach it," Ethan said. "She just handed it off." Dr. Marsh looked at him. "She mailed me a hard drive," he said. "She built something in me when I was 14 years old, working in my grandfather's shop. She spent 30 years building a company, and she also spent 30 years building her son, and apparently she had enough faith that the two things would find each other eventually." He paused. "She just got the timing wrong." Dr. Marsh was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked hearing you say that. She would have told me I was being sentimental." "Yes," Dr. Marsh said. "And then she would have liked it." Sophie appeared in the doorway of the main floor, wearing her jacket because she'd developed the habit of putting it on around 4 when the day started to feel like it was winding down, regardless of whether they were going anywhere. "Dad," she said, "the lady with the red car says there's pizza." "Sandra has pizza?" "There's boxes." Sophie pointed down the hall. "Paul found them. He seems very happy about it." From somewhere down the corridor, Paul's voice confirmed, "There is a lot of pizza." Ethan looked at Dr. Marsh. She was already gathering her papers. They ate pizza in this conference room, all 5 of them. Ethan, Olivia, Dr. Marsh, Sandra, Paul, plus Sophie, who sat between Ethan and Paul and ate 2 slices of cheese with the systematic efficiency of a child who takes food seriously. The conversation moved between the technical and the legal and the logistical in the fragmented, overlapping way of a group of people who are all working on the same problem from different angles and are too tired to keep their threads separate. Sandra said the federal referral would go out first thing in the morning. She'd spoken to a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division who had flagged Vantage Propulsion Systems as a company of interest 18 months ago for an unrelated reason that turned out to be related. A whistleblower complaint from a former employee about irregular research procurement practices that had been sitting in a queue without enough supporting evidence to move forward. Calloway Aerospace's documentation would change that. "How fast does the FBI move?" Ethan asked. "Faster when the evidence is this organized," Sandra said. She nodded at Paul. "Your documentation was excellent, by the way." Paul, who was on his 3rd slice of pepperoni, looked simultaneously pleased and like he was trying not to show it. "I just followed protocol," he said. "You did it very well," Sandra said, and Paul went back to his pizza with the slightly flushed look of a young person who has been competent in front of someone important and knows it. After dinner, Olivia walked Ethan out to the parking lot. It was clear and cold, the kind of clear that came after a snowfall when the air had been scrubbed by precipitation and everything was sharp-edged and still. The sky above Bismarck was enormous and dark and full of stars, in the way that sky is when you're in the middle of a continent and there isn't enough light pollution to dilute it. Sophie was back inside with Dr. Marsh, who had produced a deck of cards from somewhere and was teaching her a game that appeared to involve a lot of slapping the table, based on the intermittent sounds coming through the door. Olivia stood with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the sky. "You're doing well," she said. "With all of it." "I don't feel like I'm doing well. I feel like I'm barely keeping up." "That's usually what doing well looks like from the inside." He looked up. The stars were very clear. He could see Orion, which was one of the only constellations he could reliably find because his grandfather had pointed it out when he was 6, and he'd never forgotten. He didn't know why some things stuck and others didn't. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "When you came to find me, After the courthouse. He paused. You knew what was happening with the company. You knew about Lawson, probably, or suspected it. You knew about the trust interference. You'd been carrying all of this for months while the board was fracturing and the data was being stolen. He looked at her. Why didn't you go to federal authorities yourself without me? She was quiet for a moment. The cold pressed gently around them. Because your mother asked me not to, she said. She was very specific. She said if something went wrong, if the company came under threat before you could be found, I should find you first. Bring you in first. She paused. She said that whatever happened with the technology, the company belonged to you. And that meant the decisions belonged to you. Not to the board, not to her former colleagues, not to me. She looked at her shoes for a moment. She trusted you with it. She just didn't get to tell you herself. He thought about his mother sitting in a hospital room, or maybe in her office on one of the days she was well enough to be there, writing instructions for contingencies she hoped would never happen. Trusting a woman she'd worked with for 5 years to carry those instructions carefully. Believing that the son she'd raised to fix engines and raise his daughter well would somehow also be the right person to hold a $4 billion company together. She didn't know me as well as she thought she did, he said. She knew you better than you know yourself, Olivia said. Which is a thing parents sometimes manage, I'm told. He almost laughed. It came out as a rough exhale that was the neighbor of a laugh, close enough. The stage 3 problem, he said, shifting because staying in the other place too long would cost him something he needed to conserve. The revised model shows it's solvable. Dr. Marsh and I need about 3 weeks of intensive modeling work to develop the solution into something we can actually test. Maybe 4 if the variables at stage 2 don't cooperate. She turned to look at him fully. That's significantly faster than anything the team projected. The team was working from wrong assumptions. Once you correct the baseline, the rest of it moves. He paused. I want to bring in 2 more engineers. People Dr. Marsh trusts. There are 3 people on the current team who are doing 2 jobs at once because of the staffing gaps, and the cognitive load is showing in their work. She nodded. I'll approve the additions. And I want to be the one to authorize them, not the board. If the company's decisions belong to me, they do. Then I need to actually make them. He looked at her. Which means I need to formally assume the trust inheritance. I need to sit down with Sandra and sign whatever I need to sign. I can set that up for tomorrow morning. Good. She looked at him for a moment in the clear cold. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite the composure he'd become accustomed to. Not the absence of it exactly, but a slight softening of the architecture beneath it, the way a face changes when the effort of maintaining a particular configuration is relaxed for a moment. I want to say something, she said. Okay. I have been running this company by myself, without the authority to actually run it, for 3 years. I have made decisions I wasn't empowered to make because they needed to be made. I have had conversations with board members who didn't respect my position and regulators who looked past me to find the person who was actually in charge. She paused. I am very good at my job. I have kept this company alive. I want to be clear about that because I'm not interested in being anyone's supporting role. I know, he said. I've noticed. But I am also She paused again, and the pause was the kind that cost something. I am also genuinely relieved that you're here, not because I needed rescuing, because I needed a partner. She looked at him steadily. Your mother built something extraordinary. I have been trying to protect it for 3 years. I would like to finish it with you. He looked at her for a moment in the cold and the starlight. Yeah, he said. Let's finish it. She nodded once. The composure resettled, but differently, slightly lighter than before. They went back inside. The next morning, Ethan signed the trust documents in Sandra's presence with Paul and Dr. Marsh as witnesses. It took 40 minutes and involved more paper than he'd expected, and his hand cramped slightly by the 3rd set of signatures, and he made a joke about it that wasn't very funny and that everyone politely smiled at anyway, which was its own kind of mercy. When it was done, Sandra handed him a folder with his copies. Congratulations, she said, in the dry way of a person for whom congratulations on a financial event is a professional formality. You're now the principal authority of Calloway Aerospace. He held the folder, It was a surprisingly ordinary-looking object for what it contained. "What happens now?" Paul asked. "Now," Sandra said, "I make calls." She made them from the conference room with the door closed. Ethan could hear, occasionally, the measured cadence of her voice, but not the words. He went back to the whiteboard with Dr. Marsh and got to work. At 11:15, Sandra opened the conference room door. "FBI Financial Crimes has accepted the referral," she said. "They're assigning a lead agent today. Given the connection to the existing Vantage complaint and the documentation we've provided, they're treating this as a priority investigation." She paused. "They'll want to speak with you directly within the next few days." "All right," Ethan said. "There's one more thing." Sandra's voice shifted slightly, not losing its precision, but adding something to it. "In the process of preparing the referral, we pulled all publicly available correspondence between Lawson's firm and its clients over the past 3 years through court filings and professional liability disclosures." She looked at Ethan. "Monica Reed filed a complaint against Derek Lawson with the State Bar Association 6 weeks ago." The whiteboard pen in Ethan's hand stopped moving. "6 weeks ago," he said. "She alleged that he had provided legal advice during the divorce proceedings that was not in her interest, and that he had used his access to her personal situation to advance professional interests she was not aware of." Sandra paused. "The complaint is currently under review, but it suggests that she became aware at some point in the last few months that she had been manipulated." He set down the pen. Dr. Marsh looked at him and then carefully looked at the whiteboard. "She didn't know," he said. Not a question, a recalibration. "That's what the complaint suggests," Sandra said carefully. "I can't tell you with certainty what she knew or when she knew it, but I can tell you she filed that complaint before we made contact with federal authorities, before you signed the trust documents. She was already trying to—" Sandra chose the word deliberately. "Correct something." He stood with this for a moment, the shape of the last year rearranging itself slightly. Not into something forgivable, necessarily, but into something more complicated than what he'd been carrying. Monica, who had taken everything in the settlement and walked away smiling, had also apparently at some point realized that the man steering her had been using her, and had tried to do something about it on her own, without involving Ethan, without knowing that the thing she'd been used to damage was larger than a divorce. "I need to talk to her," he said again. "Now?" Sandra asked. "Soon." He picked up the pen. "But not today. Today I need to be here." He turned back to the whiteboard. The stage 3 diagram was waiting for him, patient the way math is patient. It doesn't care how long you take, only whether you get it right. He looked at it. He picked up where he'd left off. Sophie came in around noon and stood beside him for a while without saying anything, watching him draw on the whiteboard the way she sometimes watched him work on engines, with the quiet, attentive interest of a child who is absorbing something she'll understand fully later. He glanced at her once without stopping what he was doing. "You okay?" he asked. "Mm-hmm." She leaned against his arm. "Dr. Marsh taught me a card game. I heard. You were very loud. I won." "I know, I also heard that." She watched him draw for another minute. "Is this what Grandma did?" He stopped. He hadn't talked to Sophie about Catherine much in the past 2 days. He hadn't had the room for it, and he hadn't known where to start, and Sophie hadn't asked until now. "Yeah," he said. "This is what Grandma did." Sophie looked at the whiteboard with the serious, focused expression she brought to things she was deciding how to feel about. "Do you think she'd like what you're drawing?" she asked. He looked at the whiteboard, at the revised models, at the lines that were beginning to resolve into something coherent, something that worked the way it needed to work. "I think," he said carefully, "she'd tell me the line spacing on the pressure diagram is too tight, and I should start that section over." Sophie considered this. "That sounds like something a grandma would say." "Yeah," he said, "it does." She pressed her face against his arm for a moment, a brief warm wait, and then straightened and went back to find Dr. Marsh and continue what sounded like an ongoing and highly competitive card game situation. Ethan looked at the whiteboard. He picked up the marker. He started the pressure diagram over. The FBI agent assigned to the case was named Roy Calder, and he was not what Ethan had expected, though Ethan wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected. Calder was in his mid-40s, heavy set in the way of someone who had been athletic once and had let the schedule win, with a gray mustache and the particular quality of stillness that came from having spent 2 decades sitting across tables from people who were lying to him. He didn't perform authority, he just had it, the way some people carry weight without making a show of it. He arrived on a Monday with a younger agent named Torres, who took notes and asked almost nothing, and they sat in the facility's conference room with Sandra Fitch and Ethan and Olivia and went through the documentation with the methodical patience of people who were not in a hurry because hurrying produced errors and errors produced appeals. "You understand," Calder said after the first hour, "that the investigation will take time. We're talking about financial records across multiple jurisdictions, corporate registrations in Delaware, and 2 other states. International data transfers that require coordination with—" "I understand it takes time," Ethan said. "I just want to know that it's moving." Calder looked at him with the measured patience of a man who had heard that sentence from many people in many rooms. "It's moving," he said. "The Vantage complaint we already had gives us significant foundation. Your documentation accelerates the timeline considerably." He paused. "I do need to ask you about Monica Reed." The room temperature seemed to shift slightly, or maybe that was just Ethan's perception of it. "What about her, Deke?" he asked. "She filed a bar complaint against Lawson 6 weeks ago. We've spoken with her." Calder's tone was factual rather than leading, the tone of someone presenting information rather than building toward a conclusion. Her account is that Lawson guided her throughout the divorce proceedings in ways she later came to believe were serving his interests rather than hers. He encouraged her to pursue an aggressive asset settlement, Shawaz, which, based on what you've told us about the trust, makes sense in context. If you were financially devastated by the divorce, you'd be less equipped to engage with anything related to your inheritance, and more likely to simply walk away from it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He'd been working toward this understanding for days, the slow revision of what he'd believed was happening against what was actually happening. It still sat uncomfortably, the way realizations do when they require you to feel a different thing about a person than you'd settled into feeling. "She knew he was using her access to my office," Ethan said. "She knew she was helping him look at documents," Calder said carefully. "She claims she believed it was relevant to the asset disclosure for the divorce proceedings. She says she didn't know what he was looking for specifically, or that it had anything to do with a company she'd never heard of." He paused. "Whether that's entirely accurate is something the investigation will determine, but the bar complaint she filed, on her own initiative before any of this surfaced publicly, is consistent with her account." Ethan looked at the table. He thought about Monica in the parking lot of Sophie's school, and the expression on her face, and all the things he'd thought it meant. He'd read it as the beginning of regret. Maybe it was something further along than that. A woman who had already been through the process of understanding what she'd been part of and was standing on the other side of it, not knowing how to say so. "I'm not going to pursue anything against her," he said. "That's your prerogatives, Calder said. "The custody arrangement stands as Judge Holt ordered it. She can have her visitation. She can have the house." He looked up. "What I want is Lawson, and whoever's behind him." "That," Calder said, "is exactly what we're after." Torres wrote something down. The meeting lasted another 2 hours. By the time it ended, the light outside had gone gray-gold with late afternoon, and Sophie had been picked up from the temporary enrollment at the nearby school by a staff member Olivia had arranged, a quiet woman named Beth, who Sophie had decided was acceptable after their first meeting, largely because Beth had a dog, whose photo she kept on her phone, and who Sophie had deemed, upon inspection, to be an excellent dog. Ethan watched the investigation begin to move and return to the engineering work, because the 2 things existed in parallel, and the second one was something he could actually control. The 3 weeks he'd estimated for the Stage 3 modeling work turned into 3.5, which he'd privately expected. Real problems took real time, and the variables at Stage 2 had, as he'd warned Olivia they might, declined to cooperate immediately. He brought in the 2 additional engineers' doctor. Marsh had recommended a fluid dynamics specialist named Harper, who arrived from a research position in Minnesota with the specific energy of someone who had been doing careful, constrained work for too long and was ready for something harder, and a materials engineer named Kowalski, who was 57 years old and had worked with Catherine Calloway in the company's early years, and who, when he walked into the facility and looked at the whiteboard with the revised meridian diagrams, stood quietly for a long moment before he said anything. "She was right," Kowalski said. "About which part?" Dr. Marsh asked. "All of it." He pointed at the revised intake geometry model. "We argued about this in 2016. I told her the inlet modification was too aggressive for the manufacturing tolerance we could achieve. She said the tolerance would catch up to the design." He looked at Ethan. "You're Catherine's son." "Yes." Kowalski extended his hand. His grip was dry and brief and entirely sincere. "Let's get this done," he said. The team that formed over those 3 weeks was not a smooth operation. They disagreed, sometimes loudly. Harper had strong opinions about computational methodology that conflicted with the approach Dr. Marsh's team had been using for 2 years. And there was a period of about 4 days when the friction between them produced an atmosphere in the main floor that required careful navigation. Ethan navigated it by putting them both in front of the same data and asking them to explain to each other, in front of him, why the other person was wrong. "That's going to make it worse," Olivia said when he told her his plan. "For about an hour," he said, "and then one of them is going to realize the other person has a point, and they'll both pretend that was obvious all along." It took 90 minutes, not an hour. But he was otherwise correct. Sophie enrolled properly in the local school during this period, which was a logistical undertaking that Ethan navigated imperfectly. There were forms he filled out wrong and had to redo, a meeting with the school counselor that he arrived 7 minutes late for because he'd lost track of time over a stage 2 calculation, a situation with the lunch account that he sorted out only after Sophie came home having eaten nothing because she hadn't understood the payment system. He fixed all of these things. None of the fixing was graceful. Sophie adapted to the new school with the resilience of a child who had learned that adapting was what you did, and within 2 weeks had identified one friend, a girl named Cora, who was also 7, and who had Sophie reported the best collection of erasers she had ever seen, and one enemy, a boy named Marcus, who she described as having a bad attitude about sharing the good markers. Ethan managed this with the imperfect, winging-it parental competence that had gotten them both this far. He packed lunches that were nutritionally inconsistent, but always included something Sophie actually liked. He helped with homework at the kitchen table of the apartment Olivia had arranged for them, a furnished 2-bedroom near the facility, nothing remarkable, with a couch that was slightly too small and a coffee maker that took 45 seconds longer than it should have to produce results. But that was clean and warm and had enough space for Sophie to spread her drawings across the floor without anyone stepping on them. It was during this time that Ethan and Olivia fell into a working rhythm that neither of them had explicitly designed, but that developed naturally, the way things develop between people who are in the same building 12 hours a day working toward the same problem. She had the corporate fluency that he lacked. He had the engineering instinct that she couldn't replicate. She understood the board and the regulatory environment and the financial architecture of the company in ways that would have taken him years to learn from scratch. He understood the research and the mechanical logic and the specific decisions that would make the Meridian system work in ways that she relied on him to make. They had a standing meeting every morning at 7:30 before the rest of the team arrived. It started as a briefing, 10 minutes, status updates, action items, and gradually extended over the weeks into something more like a working conversation. They'd stand at the whiteboard and talk through both the engineering problems and the business implications of solving them. She'd push back when his engineering thinking outpaced the commercial constraints. He'd push back when her financial conservatism conflicted with what the research actually needed. They didn't always agree. The disagreements were direct and occasionally tense, and always resolved because they were both capable of changing their minds when the argument was good enough. One morning, about 5 weeks in, Olivia arrived at the facility to find Ethan already at the whiteboard with a coffee that was still hot, which meant he hadn't been there long, looking at the stage 3 diagram with the expression she'd learned to recognize as the one he wore when something had resolved in his head overnight. "You figured something out," she said. "Maybe." He pointed at the thermal exchange component, the exchange surface geometry. "I've been treating it as a fixed variable because the manufacturing constraints Dr. Marsh flagged in 2019 were real. But Kowalski said something yesterday about tolerance capability at the Fargo facility that made me think those constraints might be outdated." He looked at her. When's the last time you had a manufacturing capability assessment done on the Fargo line? 18 months ago. Before or after they upgraded the CNC capacity? She paused. Before. So the tolerances Kowalski was told were impossible in 2016 and that Dr. Marsh flagged in 2019 might now be achievable, which means the exchange surface geometry I've been designing around a constraint that might not exist anymore. He looked at the board. I need to get down to Fargo and look at the line. Olivia looked at him. You want to go to the manufacturing facility? I want to see the actual machines, not the spec sheets. He paused. I've been designing from documentation. I need to design from metal. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was almost fond, in the way a person can be almost fond of someone who is being exactly themselves. I'll arrange it, she said. They drove to Fargo that Thursday, which was a 2.5-hour drive through landscape that was, in early March, beginning to show the first tentative signs of being willing to reconsider winter. The snow was still everywhere, but its texture had changed, softening at the edges. Ethan drove because he'd asked to, and Olivia sat in the passenger seat of her SUV. She'd offered the SUV because the Silverado was a genuine safety concern at highway speeds in these conditions, which was true and which Ethan had acknowledged without argument. Sophie came with them, sitting in the back seat with her library book and her headphones, a travel configuration she'd perfected over years of being a kid whose parent worked irregular hours and couldn't always arrange childcare on short notice. She was, in Olivia's private observation, a remarkably self-contained child, not distant or withdrawn, but possessed of an internal life that didn't require constant external input. She could be by herself without being lonely, which was a quality that took some adults their whole lives to develop. They stopped for lunch at a diner halfway because Sophie had been watching the snow and had announced that she needed pancakes, and Ethan had agreed without needing further argument because he was also hungry, and pancakes were not a bad call. The diner was the type that existed all along the interstate through the upper Midwest. Worn countertops, booth seats with cracked vinyl repaired with tape, coffee that was genuinely excellent in the way roadside diner coffee sometimes was, without being able to explain why. The waitress was a woman in her 60s who called Sophie sweetheart and brought her a booster menu and a box of crayons without being asked. You don't need to do that, Ethan started. She's 7, the waitress said. Of course she does. Sophie was already looking through the crayons with the focused interest of a professional appraising inventory. They sat across from Olivia and Ethan in the booth, Sophie between the window and the wall with her crayons and her menu, and for a few minutes it was just 3 people in a diner waiting for pancakes, which was an ordinary thing, the kind of ordinary that Ethan hadn't had much of recently, and which he felt the absence of in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Can I ask you something? Olivia said. Yeah. The company. When this is done, when the meridian system is complete and the investigation resolves and the board is stabilized. She held her coffee cup. What do you actually want? Not what makes operational sense. What do you want? He looked at her. It was a genuinely direct question, and she was waiting for a genuinely direct answer. I want to build things, he said. That's all I've ever wanted. Doesn't matter what scale. A transmission in my garage or a propulsion system for regional aviation. The thing that matters to me is that it works, that it does what it's supposed to do. He paused. I want Sophie to have a stable life. I want to not be in a rental room. He stopped. He wasn't used to enumerating what he wanted. It felt slightly exposed the way honest answers to honest questions sometimes do. I want the company my mother built to be what she intended it to be. Not because it belongs to me, but because she spent her whole life on it, and it should exist in the world the way she imagined it. Olivia listened to all of this without interrupting. And you? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. I've been asking myself what I want for 3 years, she said. The answer kept changing depending on what crisis was happening at the time. She looked at her coffee. Right now, today, what I want is to finish what I started. To see the meridian system fly. Literally fly in a real aircraft, on a real route, the way your mother drew it out in 2013 in a conference room in this city. She looked up. After that, I don't know. I haven't let myself think past the end of this for a long time. Sophie slid a crayon drawing across the table. It appeared to be a picture of an airplane with a disproportionately large engine and a sun that was also possibly a flower. I drew your company, she told Olivia. Olivia looked at it. Something in her face went soft, genuinely, without the composure stepping in to manage it. It's very good, she said. The engine's the important part, Sophie said. Dad told me. He's right. The pancakes arrived. They ate. The crayon drawing stayed on the table. The Fargo manufacturing facility was larger than Ethan had pictured. A long, low building with the particular industrial hum of large-scale precision work. The sound of equipment operating at the margins of what equipment could do. The floor manager, a woman named Reyes, who had worked in aerospace manufacturing for 20 years, and who wore her hair back with the efficient practicality of someone who spent her days around moving machinery, walked him through the CNC line with the pride of someone showing you something they'd built through sustained effort. He spent 3 hours on that floor. He touched the machines. He talked to the operators. He asked questions that Reyes answered with increasing interest, because they were the questions of someone who understood what the machines were doing rather than what they were supposed to be doing. The tolerance capability was what he'd hoped. Better, actually. He drove back to Bismarck that evening with the geometry of the exchange surface resolved in his head, the way solutions resolved when you put your hands near the actual materials, something about physical proximity to the problem that documentation couldn't replicate. Well? Olivia asked. We can build what I'm thinking, he said. The tolerances are there. It's going to require close collaboration with Reyes's team on the fabrication specs, and it's going to take longer than a standard component run, but it's possible. How much longer? 6-8 weeks for the first prototype component. If it performs the way the model suggests, we're looking at a full system prototype by the fall. Olivia was quiet for a moment, watching the road go gray in the headlights. Your mother said 2019, she said. That was her original target for a working prototype. We're 6 years behind. We're here, he said. That counts for something. The federal investigation moved in its own time, as Sandra had said it would. But it moved. In early March, a grand jury in Denver returned indictments against 3 executives at Vantage Propulsion Systems and their corporate attorney related to the procurement of proprietary research through unlawful means. The charges included wire fraud, trade secret theft, and conspiracy. The full architecture of what Lawson had constructed, exposed and named. Derek Lawson's name appeared in the indictment as an unindicted co-conspirator, which meant the federal investigation of him directly was ongoing and would result in its own charges. Sandra explained this to Ethan over the phone with the precise clarity that was her way of communicating important information. The co-conspirator designation means they have him, she said. They're building the full case before charging him separately. It's more thorough this way, more complete. And Monica? No charges. The investigation found no evidence that she had knowledge of or materially participated in the theft or the trust interference. She was used as a point of access and was not aware of the full scope. A brief pause. The Bar Association suspended Lawson's license pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings, which means he no longer has the ability to practice law. Ethan absorbed this. All right, he said. He called Monica that evening from the apartment, after Sophie was in bed. He sat at the kitchen table with the coffee maker making its slightly too long 45-second process and dialed her number, and she picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd seen his name and made a decision to answer. Ethan. Her voice was careful. Monica. He paused. I know about the bar complaint. Silence for a moment. How? The investigation. It came up in the documentation. He paused. I wanted you to know that I'm not coming after you. Whatever happened with the divorce settlement, keep it. I don't want to spend years in court over a house. More silence. He could hear her breathing. I didn't know what he was looking for, she said. In your office. He told me it was financial disclosure documentation, things you were hiding from the settlement. Her voice was flat and careful in the way voices get when someone is reciting something they've rehearsed because the unrehearsed version is too hard. I was angry at you. I thought you were hiding things. He made sure I thought that. I know, Ethan said. I'm not asking you to. She stopped. I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know that I understood, eventually, what I'd been part of. And I tried to do something about it. I know that too. Another silence. How's Sophie? Good. She made a friend with an impressive eraser collection, a sound that was very close to a laugh. That sounds right. She paused. Is she happy there? Yeah, he said. She is? Good. Monica's voice was very even. That's all that matters. They talked for 11 more minutes, which was more than Ethan had expected and less than Monica probably needed, and when they hung up it wasn't resolved. It was never going to be resolved in the way that clean stories resolved things, tied up and finished. But it was something. The acknowledgement of a complicated reality between two people who had made a mess of their shared life and were now, slowly, finding the edges of a different arrangement. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after. The coffee maker had finished its process, and the result was sitting in the carafe cooling. He poured a cup he didn't particularly need and held it. Sophie's drawing from the diner was on the refrigerator. He'd put it there with a magnet that came with the furnished apartment, a sunflower magnet, which Sophie had approved of. The airplane with the important engine and the ambiguous sunflower looked at him from across the kitchen. Derek Lawson was arrested on a Thursday in April. Ethan heard about it from Sandra, who called at 8 in the morning with the brisk efficiency of someone delivering information they have been waiting to deliver. Federal marshals executed the arrest this morning at his residence in Fargo, she said. Charges include wire fraud, conspiracy to commit trade secret theft, and 2 counts of fraud upon the court related to the trust notification. Manipulation. A pause. He'll be arraigned this afternoon. Okay, Ethan said. That's it? Okay? What else would I say? Sandra considered this. Most people have more of a reaction. I have a reaction, he said. I'm just not performing it over the phone. She accepted this. The Vantage executives entered plea negotiations last week. We expect resolution within 60 days. The stolen data will be formally enjoined, which means they can't use or further develop anything they took. She paused. Your company's intellectual property will be legally secured. Thank you, Sandra. That's what I'm here for. A brief pause that was, from Sandra, the equivalent of warmth. Your mother would be pleased with how this has gone. I knew her slightly, as I said. She was not easy to please. Another pause. You've done well. He thanked her again and ended the call. He stood in the facility's parking lot, where he'd taken the call because Sandra always called at inconvenient moments, and he developed the habit of stepping outside. The April morning was cool, but not cold, the first genuinely not cold morning they'd had, and the sky above the flat land was a pale, clear blue that felt like a beginning. He didn't feel triumphant. He'd expected to, maybe, and he didn't. He felt tired in a way that wasn't unpleasant. The tiredness of having carried something heavy a long distance and finally put it down. The particular fatigue of a long effort reaching its resolution point. He felt something else, too, underneath the tiredness, quieter and harder to name. Something like the shape of what came next. He went back inside. Olivia was at the whiteboard. She looked up when he came in and read his face with the directness she brought to everything. Sandra called? She asked. Lawson's arrested. Vantage is in plea negotiations. She held his gaze. And? And it's done, he said. The investigation piece, anyway. She nodded slowly. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The whiteboard between them held the latest iteration of the Stage 3 solution, the pressure diagrams with the correct line spacing, the intake geometry that the Fargo facility could actually build to the tolerance it required. The prototype component specs go to Reyes tomorrow, she said. I know. Which means we're into fabrication phase. She paused. Which is the part your mother didn't get to see. He looked at the board, at the work, at the thing that was going to exist in the physical world because his mother had imagined it and spent her life toward it and had handed whatever she couldn't finish to a son she'd trusted with it, even when she couldn't tell him she was doing so. She got to see it, he said. She's the one who drew it. Olivia looked at him. The morning light through the windows was very clear. The board wants a formal meeting, she said. Now that the legal situation is resolving and you're officially the principal authority, they want to discuss the company's future direction. She paused. It's going to be a long meeting. When is it? Next week, Minneapolis. All right. He looked at the whiteboard one more time, then turned toward the engineering floor. Tell them I'll be there. He paused. And tell them to be prepared for the technical briefing to take longer than they've scheduled it. Something crossed Olivia's face. Should I tell them why? Because, he said, I'm going to walk them through the meridian system myself. Start to finish. And I want them to actually understand what my mother built before they have any more opinions about what to do with it. Olivia wrote something on her notepad. That, she said without looking up, is exactly what she would have done. He went to find Dr. Marsh and get to work. The Fargo fabrication specs weren't going to write themselves, and Reyes had already emailed twice this week asking about the timeline, and the Stage 2 variables were still not entirely cooperating, and there was a board meeting to prepare for, and Sophie had a school project about state history that she'd mentioned 3 times in the past 2 days, in the specific way children mention things they need help with but won't directly ask for. None of it was clean, none of it was finished, but it was moving, all of it, in the direction it was supposed to move. That was enough. The board meeting in Minneapolis lasted 6 hours and 40 minutes, which was 2 hours and 40 minutes longer than the board had scheduled it and exactly as long as it needed to be. Ethan had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything complicated, by stripping it down to what was actually true and then building back up from there, without decoration, without the corporate language that tended to make important things sound like they were happening to someone else. He brought Dr. Marsh and Kowalski with him as technical support, and Olivia sat to his left at the long conference table and said almost nothing for the first 3 hours, because she'd been saying things to this board for 3 years and had decided that the most useful thing she could do now was let Ethan say them instead. There were 11 board members. Some of them had known Catherine Calloway personally. Some had joined after her death and knew her only as the name on the building. All of them were accomplished and intelligent and had spent the better part of 3 years trying to make decisions about a company whose most important asset they could not fully evaluate because the person who understood it best was a mechanic in Bismarck they'd never been told about. Ethan started with the meridian system, not with the financial projections or the market analysis or the competitive positioning, with the engineering. He stood at the head of the table with a tablet connected to the room's display screen and walked them through the system from first principles, the way Dr. Marsh had walked him through it in those first hours in the facility, except that he did it from the inside rather than the outside. He showed them the intake geometry revision. He showed them the Stage 3 thermal exchange solution. He showed them the manufacturing capability confirmation from Fargo and the fabrication specs that were already in Reyes's hands. He showed them what his mother had built and what he was finishing, and he did it in plain language because the technology was extraordinary and didn't need help from jargon. About 90 minutes in, a board member named Callister, silver-haired, formal in the way of someone who'd been in boardrooms his whole career, raised his hand. The Stage 3 solution, he said. You're saying this was available to the research team for the past 6 years and they simply didn't find it? I'm saying the foundation for it was in the original Meridian framework, Ethan said. My mother laid it in. The team was working from a modeling assumption that was slightly off, which made the solution invisible from the angle they were approaching it. It happens in engineering. You're so close to a problem that you lose the perspective you'd have if you stepped back. And you stepped back. I came in fresh. That's different from stepping back, but the effect is similar. He paused. My mother knew what the solution was. I think she was a few months from articulating it formally when she got sick. The hard drive she sent me, there are notes on it that point directly toward the intake geometry approach. She was already there. She just ran out of time to finish writing it down. The room was quiet for a moment. She trusted you to find it, another board member said. A woman in her 60s named Petra Voss, who had known Catherine and whose expression throughout the morning had been difficult to read. She trusted me to look, Ethan said. There's a difference. Petra Voss looked at him for a long moment and then nodded, once, with the deliberate weight of a person who has been assessing something carefully and has reached a conclusion she's willing to commit to. The second half of the meeting moved into operational territory. Company structure, Ethan's formal role, Olivia's ongoing position, the path forward for the Meridian Development Program. This was where Olivia leaned forward, because this was the ground she knew better than anyone in the room, and the two of them moved through it together in the particular rhythm they'd developed over months of 7:30 whiteboard sessions, finishing each other's points without fanfare, disagreeing in two places where they actually disagreed and not papering over it. Callister watched this dynamic with the assessing eyes of a man who had evaluated many partnerships over a long career. "You two have been working together for how long?" he asked during a break. "About 4 months," Olivia said. "You work like it's been considerably longer." Neither of them answered that directly. Olivia poured coffee. Ethan looked at his notes. Callister observed this with the private satisfaction of a man who has noticed something he wasn't supposed to notice and is keeping it to himself. The board voted unanimously at the end of the meeting to formally confirm Ethan as the company's principal executive authority and to ratify Olivia's ongoing role as chairwoman, which was the title she'd held in practice for 3 years and in name for approximately 4 hours, since the previous formal structure had been technically provisional. They approved the Meridian development budget and the Fargo fabrication timeline and the addition of 3 more engineers to the research team. Walking out of the building into the Minneapolis evening, Ethan stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at the sky for a moment. The city around him was the kind of busy that large cities have in the early evening. Traffic, pedestrians, the specific organized chaos of a place with too many people trying to get to too many different places at once. He'd never particularly loved cities. He found them useful and somewhat exhausting in about equal measure. Olivia stopped beside him. "You did well in there." "Callister was testing me for the first hour." "Callister tests everyone for the first hour. He tested me for the first 6 months." She pulled her coat tighter. "You passed at about minute 45 for reference. When you corrected his understanding of the thermal exchange mechanism without making him feel stupid about it." "He wasn't stupid about it. He just had incomplete information." "That's exactly why you passed," she said. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold Minneapolis evening, and Ethan thought about what the day had actually been. Sitting at the head of that table, talking about his mother's work in front of people who had tried to make decisions about it for years without the right foundation, watching understanding land in the room, watching the vote. It had been something. He wasn't sure he had the right word for what it had been. "She should have been there," he said. Not with bitterness, just the plain truth of it. Olivia was quiet for a moment. "She was," she said, "in everything you said." He looked at her. She was looking at the traffic, not at him, with the expression she sometimes had when she said something she meant but hadn't entirely intended to say out loud. He didn't respond to it directly. Some things didn't need response. "I need to call Sophie," he said. "Beth has her until 9. "Go," Olivia said. "I'll get the car." He called Sophie while leaning against the building's exterior, the cold stone at his back. Sophie's voice in his ear, telling him about Cora's newest eraser acquisition and a situation involving Marcus and the good markers that had apparently escalated and then de-escalated and then escalated again in a manner Sophie considered newsworthy. He listened to all of it and asked the right questions, and laughed once genuinely when Sophie's description of the marker situation involved a hand gesture he couldn't see but could entirely picture. And when she asked how his day was, he said it had been long and pretty good, and that he'd tell her about it when he got home. "Did you build something?" she asked. She'd come to understand his work in those terms. Her father's job was building things, which meant anything he did at the company fell into the category of building. "I think so," he said. "Yeah." "Good," she said, with the satisfied finality of someone who considers the matter resolved. "Beth made pasta." "Is it good pasta?" "It's okay pasta," she said, with the diplomacy of a child trying to be fair. "The noodles are a little soft." He drove back to Bismarck that night because he didn't want to stay in a hotel, and because Sophie was there, and because, somewhere in the past 4 months, Bismarck had become the place he was going back to rather than the place he was stuck. He wasn't sure exactly when that had shifted. These things didn't announce themselves. They just changed, quietly, while you were paying attention to something else. The fabrication work in Fargo took 8 weeks. Reyes ran it with the focused precision of someone who understood they were building something that mattered and didn't need to be told twice what the tolerances required. She called Ethan directly when questions came up, which he appreciated, and he drove down twice to look at the component in progress with his own eyes, because documentation was useful, but metal was real. The first prototype component came off the line on a Tuesday in late June. Ethan was there when it did. So was Dr. Marsh, who had not missed a significant milestone in the Meridian system's development in 11 years and was not going to start now. Reyes handed the component to Dr. Marsh, who turned it over in her hands with the careful attention of someone inspecting something they've spent a long time waiting to hold. She handed it to Ethan. It was smaller than he'd expected, the way important things sometimes are. A compact assembly of precisely manufactured components that represented 2 years of focused work and 6 years before that, and Catherine Calloway's entire vision of how a fuel system should move. He turned it over in his hands. The tolerances were exactly what he'd specified. Better, actually, because Reyes's team had found a fabrication refinement that improved the surface finish beyond what the spec required. "It's right," he said. "Yes, Dr. Marsh said. "It is." He handed it back carefully. Reyes was watching him with the expression of someone who has made something with their hands and is watching someone else recognize what it is. He nodded at her. She nodded back. They put the component into testing that afternoon. The testing took 3 weeks, which was exactly as long as it was supposed to take if you were doing it correctly and not cutting corners to produce a result faster than the process could validate it. Ethan had been insistent about this with the board in Minneapolis. The timeline is the timeline, and the timeline is what makes the result trustworthy. He'd said it plainly, and Callister had looked like he wanted to push back, and then had looked at Petra Voss, who had shaken her head almost imperceptibly, and had not pushed back. The results, when they came back in late July, were better than the model had predicted. The thermal performance at Stage 3 exceeded the design target by 4%, which was a small number with large implications. It meant the system's overall efficiency gain against conventional propulsion was at the higher end of the projected range, closer to 38% than 31%. Dr. Marsh ran the numbers 3 times. Harper ran them independently. Kowalski ran them on paper, by hand, the way he'd done calculations since before computational modeling was the assumed approach, and came back with the same figure. Ethan sat with the results printout in the conference room and read it twice. Then he walked to the main floor and stood at the whiteboard where the Meridian system diagrams had lived for months, and he looked at it for a long time. Dr. Marsh came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything. She'd been doing that, standing beside him in silence at significant moments, since that first night when he'd looked at the schematic and told her the pressure ratio was wrong, and he'd come to understand it as her way of marking things, not celebrating exactly, acknowledging. "We need to tell Olivia," he said. "She's on a call with the board. She'll be done in 20 minutes. I'll wait." He waited by the whiteboard. When Olivia came through the door 22 minutes later and saw his face, she stopped. "The results came back," she said. "Yes." She crossed the floor. He handed her the printout. She read it. He watched her read it, watched the thing that happened in her face, the controlled composure he'd been watching for months finally doing something it didn't have a mechanism to prevent. Her eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together for a moment. 38, she said. 38.2, he said. She looked at the printout again, and then at the whiteboard, and then at him. Your mother, she said, and then stopped, because the sentence didn't need an ending. Yeah, he said. She handed the printout back. Her hand, when their fingers briefly overlapped on the paper, was slightly cold the way hands get when you've been sitting in a meeting room for an hour, and the circulation decides it has better things to do. He noticed this the way you notice small physical details about people you've been in close proximity to for a long time, without deciding to. He held the printout. We need to file the updated patent documentation before we announce anything, she said, because she was Olivia, and the first practical step was the thing she went to when the emotional weight of a moment threatened to become too much. Sandra's already been briefed, he said. She filed a provisional update last week. Olivia blinked. You were that confident? I was that ready, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he'd seen develop slowly over the past months, something that had started as professional respect and had acquired, incrementally, a quality that was harder to categorize. She hadn't named it. He hadn't named it. They'd been in close enough proximity for long enough that naming it would have required one of them to step back from the work and look at the other person directly, which they'd both been consistently not quite doing. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. I need to tell you something that isn't about the company." He looked at her. She stopped. She had the expression of someone choosing words with more than usual care, which for Olivia was significant because she always chose words with care. "Working alongside you for these months has been the most functional I've felt since your mother died," which is a strange thing to say and probably not the most elegant way to say it, but it's accurate. "Functional," he said. "I mean," she pressed her fingers to her temple briefly. "I mean that I came to find you because I needed your name on documents and your knowledge of the engineering. And what happened instead was that I found someone who—" She stopped again. "Who I didn't expect." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "For reference, I'm bad at it." "I know," she said. "I've watched you be bad at several things over 4 months, and it hasn't been a problem yet." Something that was not quite a laugh escaped him. "That's a low bar." "It's an honest bar." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you something true. Because I've spent my whole career saying only what was strategically useful, and I'm trying to stop doing that." He looked at her. The morning light through the windows was the particular gold of late July, full and warm, the kind of light that made ordinary rooms look like paintings without being asked. He thought about the parking lot outside the courthouse, where he'd first seen her step out of a black SUV with the composure of someone carrying a very heavy thing without letting it show. He thought about the diner and the pancakes, and Sophie's drawing of the airplane with the important engine. He thought about 7:30 morning meetings and whiteboard arguments, and the way she'd stood in the doorway of the back room that first night, tired in a way she couldn't hide, and said goodnight, Ethan, like someone who meant considerably more than 2 words could carry. "I know you're not asking," he said. "I'm just trying to figure out how to respond to something I didn't expect either." "You don't have to respond today," she said. "I know." He looked at the whiteboard, at the meridian system that was real now, that had results and test data and a prototype component in a facility in Fargo. "But I want to." She waited. "I think," he said carefully, because he was bad at this, and he knew it, and he was doing it anyway, "that the last year of my life was the worst and the most important year I've had, and a significant part of why I got through it with anything intact is standing in front of me." He paused. "I think Sophie draws you in every airplane picture now, which is either an artistic choice or a statement, and with Sophie it's usually a statement." He paused again. "And I think if you wanted to, not because of the company, not because of any of this, I would like to know you in a way that isn't structured around a crisis." Olivia looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. I told you I was bad at it." "It was also completely sincere," she said, "which is rarer." She held his gaze. "All right. All right? All right," she said, and something in her face settled into a different configuration, not softer exactly, but less defended. More present. Like a window that's been painted shut finally being opened, just slightly, just enough to let the air in. Dr. Marsh appeared in the doorway. She looked at both of them, took in the room with the perception of a woman who had been reading situations for 50-plus years and had not gotten worse at it. "The results are going out to the board," she said, in the tone of someone who is announcing a practical matter while being fully aware that she has interrupted something that is not a practical matter. "I thought you'd both want to be on the call." "We'll be right there," Olivia said. Dr. Marsh withdrew. They could hear, faintly, the sound of her telling Paul to pull up the board call interface, the ordinary machinery of work continuing around them. Ethan looked at Olivia. "Later," she said. "Later," he agreed. They went to take the call. The announcement of the Meridian System's prototype completion went to the aviation industry press in September. The response was significant, the kind of significant that started as careful industry interest, and then, as the numbers became public, escalated into the kind of attention that brought journalists and analysts and competitors who wanted to understand what had changed. What had changed was that a technology that had been theoretical for 6 years was now physical. It had a component in a test rig and data that could be read, and results that could be verified independently, and in an industry built on fuel costs and operational margins, those results meant something concrete and large. The board authorized a formal development partnership announcement with 2 regional carriers who had been in quiet discussion with Olivia for months, contingent on the prototype results. The partnership was structured around a licensing arrangement that would fund the full system development and position Calloway Aerospace as the technology provider rather than an operator, which was, as Olivia explained to the board and to Ethan in about equal measure, the structure Catherine had always intended. Build the engine. License the engine. Don't become an airline. Derek Lawson was convicted in October on all counts, in a trial that lasted 9 days and produced a sentence of 7 years in federal prison. The Vantage executives who had entered plea negotiations in the spring received their sentences in a separate proceeding, 2 of them with prison time, one with a suspended sentence and significant financial penalties. The stolen research was formally enjoined. All derivatives of the Calloway Aerospace intellectual property in Vantage's possession were ordered destroyed under federal supervision, which Paul described to Ethan as genuinely satisfying to think about, and which Ethan agreed with without elaborating. Sandra Fitch called when the Lawson verdict came in. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. "How do you feel?" He thought about it honestly. He was standing in the apartment's kitchen, the one with the 45-second coffee maker and the sunflower magnet on the refrigerator. Sophie's school drawings had accumulated on the refrigerator door over the months until they were stacked 3 deep in places, a palimpsest of 7-year-old creativity covering about 60% of the available surface area. "Like I can stop carrying something," he said. "That's the main thing." "That's usually how justice feels," Sandra said. "Less triumphant than people expect, more like relief." "Yeah," he said. "That's it." There was a conversation he still needed to have. He'd been aware of it for months, carrying it the way you carry an obligation you haven't found the right moment for. He found the moment in November, on a day when Sophie was at Cora's house and the apartment was quiet, in the particular way that apartments get when the person who fills them is elsewhere. He opened the envelope that Sandra had set aside from the hard drive, the letters his mother had drafted and never sent. There were 4 of them, handwritten and scanned. His name on each one. He sat at the kitchen table and read them. He sat there for a long time after. He wasn't going to describe what they said, not to anyone, not even to Diane when she called later that week. Some things were not for sharing. Some things were just for the person they were intended for, received years late, arriving at a moment that turned out to be exactly the right one. He folded them carefully and put them back in the envelope. He sat there for a while longer in the quiet apartment, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window in the long, low way of November light, golden and a little melancholy, the way things get when the year is running toward its end and the dark comes earlier each evening. He wasn't angry. He'd been through the anger months ago, somewhere around the 2nd week in the facility, working late on the stage 2 variables while Sophie slept in the back room. It had moved through him and left, the way weather moves through a place and leaves it changed, but not destroyed. He thought about his mother making an impossible choice, between protecting her son from a world that had changed her in ways she was afraid of, and letting him into the things she'd spent her life building. She'd chosen protection and gotten it wrong. She'd known she'd gotten it wrong, if the letters were any indication. She'd tried to correct it, imperfectly, by sending a hard drive and laying groundwork and trusting Olivia to find him. Nobody gets it perfectly right. That was the thing that kept coming back to him across all of it, across the divorce and the custody and the company and Lawson and Vantage and everything that had happened since February. Nobody gets it perfectly right. Not Catherine, not Monica, not Ethan himself, not Olivia with her practiced composure that was a way of protecting something she was afraid to lose. They all did the best they could with what they understood at the time, and the best they could was imperfect and sometimes costly, and sometimes, in spite of everything, enough. It was enough. The Calloway Aerospace Innovation Center broke ground on the 1st of December in a ceremony in Bismarck that was modest by the standards of corporate events. No grand stage, no elaborate production. A cleared lot on the south side of the city, not far from the satellite facility where all of this had started. A small crowd of city officials and company staff and community members who had heard that several hundred jobs were coming to their city and had decided that warranted standing in the cold for 45 minutes. Ethan stood beside Olivia and spoke for about 6 minutes. He said what was true, that the Innovation Center was built on the work of people who had spent years quietly doing extraordinary things in an ordinary-looking building, and that those people deserve the acknowledgement of a larger space and more resources, and the acknowledgement, full stop. He said that his mother had imagined this city as a place where the kind of work she was doing could put down real roots, and that he intended to make good on that imagination. He said it plainly. The crowd was warm. Sophie was standing to his left between him and Olivia, wearing her winter coat and her uneven braids and a pair of boots that were slightly too big because she was between sizes and they'd bought the next size up for room to grow. She was holding Olivia's hand on one side and his on the other, not because anyone had arranged it that way, but because that was where she'd migrated during the ceremony, finding the configuration that made sense to her. A reporter from the local television station got to Olivia afterward with a microphone and the standard question, why invest this heavily in a mid-sized city in North Dakota? What's the strategic rationale? Olivia started to answer because answering strategic questions was something she could do in her sleep. Ethan looked at Sophie, who had detached from Olivia's hand and was now attempting to make a snow angel in the thin layer of snow at the edge of the cleared lot, with the complete commitment of a child who has identified an opportunity and sees no reason to defer it. Because this is where she belongs, he said. The reporter turned to him. Olivia stopped mid-sentence. He looked at Sophie, making her snow angel with total absorption, her arms sweeping wide, her face turned up to the December sky. This city, he said, this is where she's going to grow up. This is where she's going to have her friends and her school and the place she thinks of when someone says home. He paused. Everything else follows from that. The reporter seemed to have expected a more strategic answer and wasn't entirely sure what to do with this one. He looked at Olivia, who gave him the kind of smile that was genuinely warm and also clearly indicated the interview was over. Sophie stood up from her snow angel and looked at the impression she'd left in the snow. "Dad?" she called. "Come look." He walked over and looked at the snow angel. It was slightly lopsided on the left side because she'd hit a patch of ice and had to adjust mid-sweep. It was not a perfect snow angel. It was a real one. "That's a good one," he said. "The left wing's wrong. It's a little asymmetrical." "Same thing." She looked at it. "I like it anyway." "Me too." Olivia had come to stand beside him. The ceremony crowd was dispersing around them, people heading back to their cars in the cold, conversations overlapping and fading. The city went on doing what cities do, indifferent and alive, full of its own concerns. Sophie looked up at both of them. She had the expression she sometimes had when she was observing a situation and forming an opinion about it that she hadn't decided whether to share. "Are you guys going to get married?" she asked. Olivia made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Ethan looked at Sophie with the expression of a parent confronting a question they should have anticipated and didn't. He started. "Because Cora's mom said that when two people go to work together every day and look at each other the way you do, they usually get married." Sophie tilted her head. "Cora's mom got married to someone from her work." Ethan paused. "That's a different situation." "How?" He did not have an immediate answer to this. Olivia, to her credit, was not offering one either. She had her coat collar pulled up against the cold and was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone finding a situation considerably funnier than they're allowing themselves to show. "Sophie," he said, "we've been working together for less than a year." "That's a long time," Sophie said, with the certainty of a child for whom a year represents a significant fraction of total life experience. "It's complicated." Sophie looked at him. Then she looked at Olivia. Then she looked at the snow angel. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone granting patience they didn't necessarily feel was required. "But the snow angel has two wings. It's supposed to have two wings. She walked back toward the group of remaining staff members, having delivered this observation and apparently considering it sufficient. Ethan looked at Olivia. Olivia looked at Ethan. "The snow angel has two wings," she said. "So I heard." A beat. "She's not wrong," Olivia said. "She's usually not." The snow that had threatened all morning finally started falling. The first real snow of December, light at first. The individual flakes visible against the gray sky before the accumulation made them anonymous. It fell on the cleared lot and on the footprints and on Sophie's lopsided snow angel, softening its edges, filling in the asymmetry on the left wing until it was indistinguishable from the right. In 6 months, the Meridian system's full prototype would run its first complete test cycle and exceed every performance benchmark by a margin that would generate the kind of industry press that people paid publicists large sums of money to produce. In 8 months, the first licensing partnership would be signed in a room in Minneapolis with Olivia on one side of the table and 2 regional airline executives on the other, and Ethan would not be in the room because he would be in Bismarck helping Sophie study for a geography test, which was something he considered the more important obligation and which Olivia had agreed with entirely. In a year, construction on the Innovation Center would be far enough along that the structural form of it was visible. A building that was not trying to be monumental, but that had the clean, purposeful lines of something built to last. 700 people would eventually work there, which was not a number that would reshape the economic profile of a large city, but would reshape the economic profile of this one, quietly and persistently, the way real change happens, not in moments, but across time. In 3 years, Sophie would stand in the Innovation Center's lobby on a school tour, her whole class filing past the exhibits about aerospace engineering, and she would stop in front of a photograph mounted on the wall. A woman with dark hair, laughing at something off camera, standing in front of a building that had not yet been built when the picture was taken. And Sophie would say to the kid next to her, without drama, without making it into anything it wasn't, "That's my grandmother, she started all of this." And then she'd move on to the next exhibit because she'd grown up knowing this, and it wasn't a surprise to her, and the ordinariness of that knowing was the best possible outcome. But that was all later. Right now it was December, and the snow was falling, and Ethan Calloway was standing on a lot in Bismarck with a woman who had found him outside a courthouse when he had nothing. And together they were watching his daughter run toward a group of people she'd come to know over the past year. Her coat open and her braids uneven, and her 2 big boots leaving the particular tracks that children leave in fresh snow. Direct and purposeful, and slightly too far apart, heading somewhere with total confidence. He wasn't sure still that he'd gotten good at any of the things he'd needed to learn this year. He was better at corporate meetings than he'd been in February. He was not better at being on time to things that had start times. He'd never entirely sorted out the apartment's coffee maker, though he'd made a kind of peace with the 45-second delay by using it as a forced pause in the morning, 30 seconds of standing in the kitchen doing nothing before the day started, which turned out to be something he needed and hadn't known how to build into his life before an appliance enforced it. He'd learned that his mother had loved him in a way that was complicated by the same force that had made her great at everything else, the absolute certainty that she knew what was best, which was sometimes right and sometimes the most costly kind of wrong there is. He'd learned that the shape of a life could change entirely in a single day, and that the change might turn out to be the thing you'd needed and couldn't have gotten to by any other route. He'd learned that people who hurt you were not always simple villains, that Monica, who had taken his house and diminished him and unknowingly handed his private life to a man who was using her, had also been a person who'd been used herself, who'd filed a complaint in a bar office alone one day because she'd understood eventually that something had been done to both of them and had tried to do something about it in the only way she knew how. He could hold both truths. It wasn't comfortable, but he could hold them. He'd learned that Olivia Harrington was, under the composure and the competence and the fluency in every room she walked into, a person who was genuinely afraid of losing what she cared about, and who expressed this fear by gripping what she was trying to protect very tightly, and who was, when she allowed herself to relax the grip slightly, someone he wanted to know for a long time. He'd learned that Sophie, who was 8 now and would be 9 in the spring, was the most precisely herself person he'd ever known. She hadn't required the upheaval of the past year to become who she was. She'd arrived that way, complete and direct and possessed of opinions about marker etiquette and eraser collections and the geometric accuracy of snow angels. The year had moved around her and she had moved through it, and she was fine, in the way that children are fine when the adults around them are honest about what is happening and show up for what matters. She was fine. He had done that right at least. He was claiming it. Olivia's hand found his, somewhere in the middle of his thinking, the way that things happen between people who have been in close orbit long enough that small moves happen before they're decided. Her hand was cold. He closed his fingers around it. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. The snow fell on the cleared lot and on the city around them and on the flat winter land that ran out to the horizon in every direction, wide and white and old. Sophie was laughing at something. He could hear it from across the lot, that particular laugh she had, full and entirely unselfconscious, the laugh of someone who hadn't yet learned to be careful about what she let other people see of her joy. He hoped she kept that. He was going to do everything he could to make sure she kept that. The divorce that had looked like an ending had been the door to everything that followed. He didn't like that it had worked that way. He didn't think suffering was a necessary condition for finding your life, and he wouldn't wish the year on anyone. And if he could have gotten here without the loss and the stripping down and the courtroom and the cracked windshield truck and the rented room with no furniture, he would have. He wasn't romantic about hard times. Hard times were just hard. But he was here. That was the only thing left to say about it. He was here, in the snow, holding a hand he hadn't planned to hold, watching his daughter run, in the city where he was going to stay. He was here. That was enough. That was everything.